Welcome back, Daisy Cakes. As many of you know, I have put together a list of my top 100 favorite fantasy authors. Why? Because I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I broke the list into 10 segments and put them in alphabetical order, and today I am putting them back together in one amazing long video. The list includes retro authors, contemporary authors, children's authors, and authors who may shock and surprise you. Are you ready, Daisy Cakes? Let's get started. Can you guess who will be first on the list? Yes? No? I'll put you out of your misery. Of course, it's Joe Abercrombie. He is the British fantasy author born in 1974, best known for the trilogy I'm recommending, the First Law trilogy, which starts with The Blade itself, published in 2006, continues with Before They Are Hanged, published in 2007, and concludes with The Last Argument of Kings, published in 2008. Now, I was a little late coming to the Abercrombie novels, mostly, I think, because the covers were a little bland, but I kept hearing so much about Abercrombie, I finally got the whole series in 2014, and I loved it. It's about a war between three factions, the Union, the Gurkish Empire, and the Northern Kingdom. There are a whole lot of POV characters, but what sets Abercrombie apart, I think, is the prose. There's a literary quality to his writing, kind of like Rothfuss. If you like dark fantasy, if you like a little military fantasy, if you're a fan of Glen Cook's Dark Company series, you'll probably really enjoy Abercrombie. Now, I ended up cheating a little bit with the next author, and I didn't realize it because half of him is in the top 100 science fiction authors, and I didn't want to have any repeats. The reason being is that he is one half of the author known as James S.A. Corey, which is the pen name of Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank. Now, I didn't realize when I compiled the list and put Daniel Abraham as a must-read fantasy author that he was also part of the James S.A. Corey duo. But I think we're safe because it's not an exact match. Abraham was born in 1969 and is also associated with George R.R. Martin, who he's collaborated with and helped adapt Game of Thrones as a graphic novel. What I recommend, however, is The Long Price Quartet, a 4-book series which began with A Shadow in Summer, published in 2006. And then there's a publication every following year, A Betrayal in Winter, An Autumn War, and The Price of Spring. Like Abercrombie, the fantasy here is a bit dark, a bit military. It's about the enlightened city-state of Saraket, which is run by this poet-sorceress, and the Empire of the Gaults, which is an expansion nation of barbarian invaders. And I always wondered if they're named after John Galt. Anyway, an excellent series that I highly recommend. Now we're going to change course quite a bit with Richard Adams, who you may recognize as the author of Watership Down. Adams was born in 1920 and passed away at the age of 96 in 2016. If you haven't heard of Watership Down, published in 1972, it's a novel about anthropomorphized rabbits. Was it written for adults or kids? I don't know, but it has become one of the seminal novels that many of us grew up with. But I'm going to go recommend a completely different novel he wrote, Maya, published in 1984, and this is definitely not a kid's book. It's set in the Beklan Empire, which is kind of this fictional Mesopotamian-like empire, and follows the life of Maya, a young woman who starts off as a slave and rises up to be the Sarah Linda, who people treat as a demigoddess. This is a book way before its time. There's some Jacqueline Carey sadomasochistic explorations in different types of relationships. And I guess there are going to be trigger warnings, and if that's an issue, look those up. But it's one of those books that has stuck with me since the 80s. I read it with my best friend, Sean, and we still talk about it to this day. It's one of those books. Going back to more regular fantasy fare, we have Katherine Addison, which is the pen name of Sarah Monette. She's published under both names, but my recommendation is published under Katherine Addison, and that is for The Goblin Emperor, published in 2014. It won the Locus Award for Best Fantasy and was nominated for the Nebula Hugo and World Fantasy Award. It's such a neat twist on fairy or fae tropes. Funny enough, and I swear I didn't plan this, but the main character is named Maya, spelled exactly like the Richard Adams book I just recommended. Maya here is the son of an elvish emperor who took a goblin wife for political reasons, so Maya is half elf, half goblin, and he pretty much lives in exile because everyone is slightly ashamed of him, and his half-brothers, who are full elves, are expected to be the heirs of the kingdom. But for reasons, Maya suddenly finds himself whisked out of exile and raised up to be the emperor, aka the Goblin Emperor. Not many elves are happy about this. It's really a great fun story that I think you should definitely check out. Now let's move on to an oldie, Piers Anthony. Anthony was born in 1934 and died just a few years ago in 2019 at the age of 89. Piers Anthony was an extremely prolific writer who started out as a science fiction writer. His first novel, Chthon, which I think is a pretty decent science fiction novel published in 1967, was nominated for a Hugo and a Nebula. But his claim to fame really came during the fantasy renaissance of the late 70s with A Spell for Chameleon, published in 1977. The first novel in his Xanth world. Xanth is a pun-heavy alternate dimension, and this dimension lives next to ours. I loved Spell for Chameleon and recommend it as part of a trilogy along with The Source of Magic and Castle Rugna. You probably don't need to go further than that, but if you really like Xanth, there are almost 50 Xanth novels. I personally think they get a little bit silly and repetitive, but your mileage may vary. By the way, this was definitely an adult fantasy, but I think because of the puns and the silliness of the books, it has gotten the reputation of being kids' books. And just as a little bit of a warning, the female characters have been accused of being problematic. I never really got that, but it may bother you. Another Piers Anthony series, which I liked even more than Xanth, is the Split Infinity series, the first book published in 1980, which is kind of a fantasy science fiction mashup, being there's two dimensions side by side, a world of magic and a world of science, and there's some crossovers during this weird game. I could go on and on about Piers Anthony since I read quite a lot of his works, but I think I'll stop here. The next author is one who I really think deserves more recognition, and that is Sarah Ashe, a British fantasy author with a fantastic series that I highly recommend called The Tears of Ardamon. The first novel in the trilogy is The Lord of Snow and Shadow, published in 2003, followed by The Prisoner of the Iron Tower, published in 2004, and Children of the Serpent's Gate, published in 2005. Here is a copy of it. And you know I really love this series because this is in hardback and I prefer books in paperback. So when you see me with the hardback book, that means I couldn't wait for the paperback to come out. Now, this series has some familiar fantasy tropes. A boy raised modestly by a single mother finds out he has a secret legacy. There are dragons and ghosts. The fate of kingdoms swings in the balance. But even though it trods familiar ground, there's something about Ashe's style or the twist she puts in her plots that give the story a really unique spin. If you like epic fantasy trilogies, I think you'll love The Tears of Ardamon. Now we're going to go back in time once again to this next author because this is another one I absolutely loved in my younger days. Robert Lynn Asprin, born in 1946, died relatively young at the age of 61 in 2008, and died allegedly holding a Terry Pratchett book. Asprin was really a darling of the D&D crowd in the 70s and 80s, aka especially with his Thieves' World books. But the books I love is his myth adventure novels, starting with Another Fine Myth, published in 1978, which started a very long-running series, which includes myth conceptions, myth directions, myth fits. You get the idea. They're about a kind of bumbling young magician named Skeeve who manages to summon a powerful demon named Oz. And these are funny little adventures with Skeeve and Oz, and if you're looking for fantasy humor, you can't go wrong with the Myth Adventure series by Robert Asprin. So we're moving on from the A's to the B's in this alphabetical list, and I have a very recent author, at least at the time of filming this video, who's next on the list, Travis Baldree, whose novel Legends and Lattes, published in 2022, has become a bit of a legend unto itself, maybe even starting a new subgenre of fantasy. At least, I never heard the term cozy fantasy until Legends and Lattes, which is a light but very heartwarming story of a woman orc warrior who retires to open a coffee shop in a small town that has never heard of coffee. The publication history of Legends and Lattes is a true Cinderella story, as it was first indie published, received such huge praise and sales that eventually Baldree was courted by traditional publishers and went on to be nominated for a Hugo and Nebula. Now this is an author to keep an eye on. I may get some blowback about this next author because he is known primarily as a horror writer, but I don't care. It's Clive Barker, one of my favorite authors of all time. I've been reading him since his books of blood, but my personal favorite of all of Barker's works are what I consider to be contemporary dark fantasy. The first is Weave World, published in 1987, about a magic carpet created by a race of magicians that opens up to another world. Tell me that's not fantasy. The second novel is Imagica, published in 1991, which is Clive Barker's magnum opus, which he, I believe, allegedly wrote on hallucinogens, and is about a secret war that spans across many parallel dimensions. Again, fantasy, but yes, also elements of horror. And if it bothers you, there's usually graphic sex in Barker's writings. And even though you'll find both of these books in the horror sections, I'll die on the hill that these are both magnificent works of contemporary fantasy. Twisted, dark contemporary fantasy, but fantasy nonetheless. The final author to round out the first 10 of the top 100 fantasy authors couldn't be further from Clive Barker, because I am talking about Kelly Barnhill, the children's author who wrote one of my favorite juvenile fantasies in at least modern times, The Girl Who Drank the Moon, published in 2016, which went on to win a Newbery Medal, which is the most prestigious award in children's literature. She also wrote the much-acclaimed adult fantasy When Women Were Dragons, published in 2022, but I haven't read that one yet, so I can't say anything about it. If you've read it, let me know what you thought about it down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Anyway, I want to talk about The Girl Who Drank the Moon because it is so good. It's one of those children's books that I think adults would love. It's written like a fairy tale, but the funny and bittersweet premise is that it's set in this town who is scared of a witch who lives in the woods because the witch eats babies. So every year they leave a baby out in the woods to appease her. But guess what? The witch doesn't eat babies. She's a wonderful person, and she takes the babies, feeds them starlight, and finds homes for them. But one of the babies she accidentally feeds moonlight. So baby girl, and this infuses the baby with magic, so the witch has to raise the girl, who she names Luna, as her own because of all these magic powers that she now has. The story is funny and heartfelt, and the main character, Luna, you can't help but love her. Her best friends are a dragon and a swamp monster. Mostly, though, it is the writing that stands out, at least for me. That's where the magic really is. Continuing with the bees, I have one of the most famous children's authors of all time, and that is L. Frank Baum, also known as the Royal Historian of Oz, who wrote, of course, the iconic children's fantasy novel The Wizard of Oz in 1900. He was born in 1856 and died in 1919 at the age of 62. I am sure you have all seen the 1939 Judy Garland movie, but have you read the books? Now, I don't remember reading the Oz books as a child. I do remember seeing a set of them. There are 14 Oz books in total on the library shelf in my elementary school, but I did read them then, or I don't remember reading them then, but I did read them as an adult, and they do hold up. Though they do read really, really young. I was pretty surprised that there was a whole storyline on what sounded like a transgender fairy tale. Ozma is a princess who was, as a baby, transformed into a boy named Tip to hide her from her enemies. Tip then transforms back into a girl as a teenager, becoming her true self. Some of the stories are really creepy and imaginative, like living porcelain dolls who are very fragile and can break, or a princess who can change her head. She has a collection of 20 heads that she can swap out with her own to change her face. These are interesting stories that have inspired many fantasy authors, notably, of course, Gregory Maguire, who wrote Wicked, which was adapted to a musical. Frank L. Baum himself was a notable supporter of the women's suffrage movement, but may have advocated for the genocide of American Indians. So there is a dark side in the land of Oz. The next author on the list is also known as a children's author, and that is John Bellairs, born in 1938 and died fairly young at the age of 53. He wrote the Lewis Barnevelt series that starts with The House with a Clock in Its Walls, published in 1973. And I've read his children's books, and they are fun and they hold up. But today, I want to talk about his adult book, just one. The Face in the Frost, published in 1969, which was written after Bellairs read Lord of the Rings. The novel wasn't that successful at the time. It certainly didn't take off like his children's books, but if it did, maybe Bellairs would have written more adult books. I don't know. But those who did read The Face in the Frost loved it, including a guy called Gary Gygax. Gygax is, of course, the creator of Dungeons and Dragons and had his book listed in the Dungeon Master's Guide as recommended reading, which is how I came to it. But it was also recommended by Ursula K. Le Guin, who said it was an authentic fantasy by a writer who knows what wizardry is all about. Also, Lynn Carter said it was one of only 3 best fantasy novels to be published after Lord of the Rings. I think Bellairs must have really been taken by Gandalf when he read Lord of the Rings, because The Face in the Frost is all about 2 wizards, one named Prospero, not the one you're thinking about, and Roger Bacon. And they're not young. They're 2 old guys. Not your usual main character fare. Unfortunately, their idyllic, peaceful lives are interrupted with the return of Melicus, an old rival and very evil wizard. There's something fairy tale-like and whimsical about his writing style, which would later serve him well when he wrote children's books, but it makes The Face in the Frost a unique and charming read. We're now going to do a 180-degree turn because the furthest thing from charming and whimsical may come from Anne Bishop, the next author on the list, born in 1955, maybe, who made a big splash with her dark fantasy series, the Dark Jewels trilogy, which started with Daughter of Blood, published in 1998, and continues with Heir to the Shadows and ends with Queen of Darkness. I think the trilogy is really fun, and the world building is kind of brilliant because the story takes place in hell, sort of. Anyway, it's a hellish universe or dimension called the Dark Realm, and there are a lot of demons and devils and witches involved in all sorts of politics and shenanigans. A girl is born named Janelle, who is destined to overthrow Satan, the High Lord of Hell. At least that's a prophecy if she lives to see adulthood. Now, there are trigger warnings galore in this book. So if that's a concern, look it up on Storygraph or somewhere like that. I also think it's interesting how the book covers have evolved because it was definitely marketed to the fantasy or dark fantasy crowd, not afraid of graphic sex or violence, but now seems to be geared more to readers of romantasy, which is interesting. Either way, if you are not a squeamish reader, I recommend the Dark Jewels trilogy, though it has also been described as trashy. Moving right along, we come to Peter V. Brett, born 1973. I absolutely love the Demon Cycle series, which starts with The Warded Man, published in 2009. Now, I didn't know this until I started looking it up, but this book was published a year earlier in the UK as The Painted Man. I think The Warded Man sounds better. Sorry, UK. There are 5 books in the series, and I would call it a dark fantasy. It's set in a world with humans, but every night demons invade from another dimension. And the demons hunt humans and cause a lot of destruction and mayhem and all that evil jazz. However, there are wards that can repel demons, and our main character, Arlen Bales, decides to learn more about wards and how to fight demons. If you like magic systems like Brandon Sanderson creates, I think you would really like the system of wards. Not to mention, the world building here is top-notch. Next, we move on to Kristen Britain, born in 1965. Her debut novel, The Green Rider, was published in 1998, and which I became obsessed with. I couldn't wait for the next one in the series. She wrote The Green Rider while she worked as a park ranger in Arcadia National Park, which was the inspiration for the setting of her novels. The story feels as though it was inspired by Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar books. I don't know if that's true or not, but just felt like that to me when I read it. It's about a woman named Kerrigan, a merchant's daughter who runs away after she is kicked out of school and eventually becomes a Green Rider. Green Riders are messengers to the king. It turns out the horses they use are more than they seem, and the Green Riders are more than they seem. It has a really great plot, really likable characters, really engaging writing. What's not to love about Kristen Britain's Green Rider series? We're going to have to talk a little bit about fantasy history for the next author on the list because it is Terry Brooks, born in 1944 and worked as an attorney until he published The Sword of Shannara in 1977. Now, why I say we have to talk about fantasy history, it's because I think Sword of Shannara, jump-started a fantasy renaissance because there were not that many fantasy books, other than Lord of the Rings, prior to 1977. In fact, Lord of the Rings pretty much constituted the fantasy books of any note. Of course, I'm kind of lying about that, but it's to make a point. Sword of Shannara, when it came out, was heralded as the second coming of Lord of the Rings. There were posters all over Walden Books, gorgeous artwork by the brothers Hildebrandt. It showed the return of elves and dwarves and wizards, this time called druids. I swear I remember this enormous marketing push when it came up, and of course I was caught up in it, and I had to get a copy as soon as it came out, and I absolutely loved it. It's really interesting because the twist of Shannara is that it is on the ruins of a civilization, maybe that was contemporary Earth, because there's artifacts of technology that very occasionally pop up. But the trilogy is massive, and there are a whole bunch of other books in the world of Shannara, so it may be a little overwhelming to get started in. So I'm actually going to recommend a much lighter and fun book, Magic Kingdom For Sale Sold, published in 1986. This is the first in the Landover series, but I think you can read this as a standalone. It's a portal fantasy about a lawyer, remember Brooks started as a lawyer, named Ben Holiday, who sees an advertisement selling a Magic Kingdom for $1 million. He thinks it's probably a joke, but he's desperate and his life is in shambles and he ends up buying it. And sure enough, he gets a magic medallion that transports him to Landover. This is a much more whimsical and I think much more fun book than Shannara, and it's a great introduction to Terry Brooks. We now come to Stephen Brust, born in 1955, whose Vlad Teltos novels are amazing, starting with the first one, Jerrig, published in 1983. Brust has been writing the series ever since. As a matter of fact, the 17th novel, Liorn, was published just a few months ago in April 2024. Now, I hear you groaning when you hear 17 novels in a series, but hear me out. First, I haven't read all 17 of the novels, and I'm still recommending them, but second, they also read as standalones. There may be some vague story continuity between the novels, but each one is its own story. Heck, you could read them out of order, and I don't think you'd miss much, because they read like hard-boiled detective novels. And our main character is a hard-boiled man named Vlad Teltos, and he has bonded with a magical little mini dragon named Jerrig, and they solve mysteries in this world where there are bloodthirsty family houses that are run kind of like the mafia, and they compete with each other, and there's all sorts of intrigue and plots and counterplots and so on. Now, since the Vlad Teltos novels have been published over a 40-year period, it's interesting to watch the writing style of Stephen Brust grow and change as he grew and changed as a writer and a person. Anyway, these are short, super fun stories, and if you're like me, you may find yourself going through them like popcorn. I found this next author through Shelve It or Shove It, where I picked books based solely on their covers because it was an odd cover. I am talking about Hollow Kingdom by Kira Jane Buxton, which was published in 2019. It was a finalist in the 2020 Thurber Prize and was ranked 53 in the top 60 books of 2019 by Good Housekeeping. It's kind of a cross between Watership Down and The Walking Dead. Seriously, hear me out. It's about the zombie apocalypse where all humans turn into zombies, but the animals do not. So it's told from the point of view of one of those animals, who is a pet crow, or was a pet crow, whose owner named him Shit Turd, or ST for short. The crow is cranky, sarcastic, lives up to his name, and doesn't know how to be a wild creature because he was raised as a domesticated pet, along with another domesticated pet, a hound dog named Dennis. I know a novel from an animal POV is kind of a strong ask for adult readers, but I'm telling you, you will not be disappointed by this funny and strangely moving book about a crow named Shit Turd. The next author got a very late start in his writing career. I'm talking about Don Callander, who was born in 1930 and died in 2008. His first novel, Pyromancer, wasn't published until 1994 when he was 62, which kind of gives hope to those of us trying to get a late start in a second career. Pyromancer is the first novel in his Mancer series, which continues with Aquamancer, Geomancer, Aeromancer. I'll be perfectly honest with you, these aren't very deep books, but I think they're fun books. They're very fast reads that tread familiar tropes. Pyromancer is about Douglas Brightblade, who becomes an apprentice to Flarman Flowerstock and eventually must battle the Ice King. It was recommended by Piers Anthony, and it's the type of book that probably would really appeal to readers of Xanth. They're light, they're funny, they're fun. Rounding out this list of 10 authors, we have another Callander. This one is Kacen Callender, who is no relation to Don Callander. At least if they are, I'll be shocked. Kacen Callender is mostly known for their juvenile books about LGBTQI characters, notably Hurricane Child and Felix Ever After, but I want to talk about their fantasy adult novel, Queen of the Conquered, published in 2019, which won the World Fantasy Award. This is one of those books that came completely out of left field, as it is an anti-hero book and a tragedy, and ultimately a fascinating read. The setting is inspired by colonial-era Caribbean islands, where white colonists have enslaved the Black indigenous population. The twist here is that some people are born with magic or have these psychic powers. The white colonists want to be the only ones with power, so they hunt down Black people that show signs of this magic, except for Sigourney Rose, who is a Black woman and a powerful psychic, but she's also part of the system. She's part of the power structure, and she owns Black slaves herself. You are not really meant to like Sigourney. And I know some people have a big problem with anti-hero characters or characters that aren't very likable or even redeemable, but I think Queen of the Conquered is brilliant and nuanced and deep. Now, there is a sequel, King of the Rising, which I hated. I do not recommend that one unless you're a masochistic reader who loves extreme tragedy. But as a standalone, I highly recommend Queen of the Conquered. Trudi Canavan, who was born in 1969 and is from Down Under. Yes, she's an Australian fantasy author. I started reading her back when her debut came out in 2001, titled The Magician's Guild. This is the first book in the Black Magicians trilogy, and is a book I suggest you start with because it is so good. It is set in the city of Emeridin, which is protected by magic, but magic is strictly controlled by the Magician's Guild. Sonia is a young girl who lives in the slums, and she finds out she has magic when she is with a gang throwing stones at a group of magicians who are protected by a magic shield, so the stones don't bother them, but the stone that Sonia throws breaks the shield. She is then hunted by the guild, and she goes deep into the dark underbelly of the city to hide from them. Now, this trilogy has lots of twists and turns, and at least the first book is a coming-of-age story. After that, she grows up a bit. Canavan has written several other series that I really like, especially The Age of Five, which is a trilogy that starts with The Priestess of the White, published in 2005. Her latest series, Millennium's Rule, starts with Thief's Magic, published in 2014. And it's a very, very strange and ambitious planet-hopping high fantasy series with two POV characters who almost never meet. It's very unusual. But for those who like traditional fantasy, I think you'll love Trudi Canavan's Black Magician trilogy. I don't often talk about sexy novels, but now I have to because our next author is Jacqueline Carey. Born in 1964, Carey's debut novel cannot be ignored. That novel is Kushiel's Dart, published in 2001. It is the first novel in the Kushiel's Legacy series, and warning, 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 it is very adult when it deals with sexuality. The story takes place in a fictional kingdom inspired by France called Terre d'Ange, which embraces all forms of sexuality, and their precept is love as thou wilt. The main character, Phaedre, was born with a red fleck in her eye, which means she is marked by the angel Nama, and also means she experiences pleasure from pain. Phaedra eventually becomes a sacred prostitute, of which there are many, both male and female, but she is particularly sought after by those with a sadistic bent. And when she finds out about a plot against the kingdom, the story really takes off. I know this is sounding really X-rated and crazy, but trust me, the writing is so elevated you will be enthralled, unless you are a prude and aren't open to alternate sexual lifestyles, in which case stay away from these books. But if not, definitely check out Kushiel's Dart by Jacqueline Carey. I am so excited to now talk about Gail Carriger, maybe the only steampunk author worth reading. Gail Carriger was born in 1976 and came to fame with her debut novel, Soulless, published in 2009. You have to read Soulless. I am telling you, just do it. Personally, before Carriger, as much as I admired the aesthetic of steampunk, I never really found a book that I thought was that good and kind of wrote off the subgenre as not for me. But then I picked up Soulless. This is set in an alternate history version of Victorian London where vampires and werewolves exist, and also a supernatural type called the Soulless who can temporarily negate vampirism and lycanthropy by touch. That's who our main character is, Alexia Terabati, who accidentally kills a vampire while nipping off from a ball to find a treacle tart. The writing is so funny and full of personality, and if you're anything like me, you'll immediately fall in love. Yes, this also probably falls under the category of paranormal romance when the handsome werewolf Lord Macon enters the scene, but even if you're not into romance, I beg you to give this a try. I don't often reread books, but this is one I have simply because it makes me smile and feel so good every time I read it. We're staying in Victorian London because our next author is Lewis Carroll, who allegedly was one of Queen Victoria's favorite authors. Born in 1932, Charles Dodgson published under the pen name Lewis Carroll, and the book you all know and love, which has become ingrained in our culture, is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, published in 1865. His mentor was fantasy author George MacDonald, who greatly inspired another Lewis, C.S. Lewis. Anyway, the first draft was originally titled Alice's Adventure Underground, which Lewis Carroll illustrated himself, but he wasn't that good of an artist, so was convinced to hire John Tenniel to reinterpret his drawings, which are the classic, amazing drawings you are familiar with. Most Alice in Wonderland books now are comprised of both Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the sequel, Alice Through the Looking Glass. These books are full of puns and parodies and use of nonsense words. Carroll was also a mathematician and embedded several references to mathematical concepts into the story. In fact, One interpretation is that the entire first book is a satire of 19th century mathematics. Now, there is a dark side to Wonderland, as it's been suggested that Carroll had unsavory desires for his inspiration, 11-year-old Alice Liddell, based on his taking nude photographs of young women. If you want to find out more, you're welcome to go down that rabbit hole. But as far as I can tell, it's 90% speculation. And for me, Alice in Wonderland is one of the touchstones of fantasy literature. Our next author is S.A. Chakraborty, born in 1985, whose debut novel, The City of Brass, published in 2017, is the first novel in the Daevabad trilogy and was nominated for a host of awards for good reason. It is great storytelling inspired by Middle East mythology and a Muslim culture. Boy, if you're looking for non-Western fantasy, you can't go wrong with The City of Brass, which is set in 18th century Cairo, where we find our main character, Nari, a woman who fakes fortune-telling to swindle people and runs some scams where she pretends to heal people, but sometimes she doesn't pretend. She actually heals people. When she accidentally summons a djinn named Dara, he recognizes that she has djinn blood and whisks her off to Daevabad, also known as the City of Brass, and as all good D&D players know, is the capital city of the jinn. There she is thrust into deadly politics and runs head-on against one of the princes of Daevabad, a devout Muslim named Ali. Yes, I think this could be called a romantasy, and I usually am not into romantasies, but there are always exceptions, and City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty is one of them. I just recently discovered this next author. Recently, like a few months ago, and that is Yangsze Choo, born in the Philippines of Malaysian Chinese descent. But her debut novel, The Ghost Bride, was published in 2013 and became a Netflix series. Her second novel, The Night Tiger, was published in 2019 to critical acclaim. She is one of the few authors who narrated her own audiobook, which was nominated for the Audie Award for Literary Fiction. But I haven't read those two books yet. I found her when I picked up her third novel, The Foxwife, published in 2024, earlier this year. I immediately fell in love with the story, told from two points of view: the eponymous supernatural foxwoman named Snow, who is seeking vengeance for her dead son, and an old detective named Baum, who takes on one last case to find out why a woman froze to death in the snow with a smile on her face. One of my favorite books of the year, literary, deep and full of layers. Check out The Foxwife by Yangsze Choo. I may surprise you all by this next author, who is known for her contemporary YA romantasies, and that's Cassandra Clare, born in 1973, who came to fame with City of Bones, published in 2007, the first in the Mortal Instrument series. I picked this up because I wanted to know what was all the fuss about these books, and now I get it. It's simply fun, supernatural fantasy romance, which was better written than Twilight, in my humble opinion. Don't come for me. The story is about a teenage girl named Clary who sees people that others don't see. And when her mother is kidnapped, she finds out she was born a shadow hunter, someone born to hunt demons. This is absolute pure popcorn fluff, and I think a super fun read. I also recognize it is probably not ultimately a book meant for me, not my cup of tea, but hey, I read the first 3 books, which I think is a complete series. There are more books after that, but I think you could get away just reading those 3. For me, Cassandra Clare is a YA fantasy author that deserves respect. Certainly, she has my respect for creating a world beloved by so many readers. Our next author, Susanna Clark, born in 1959, has only written 2 novels, but what novels they are. The first is my favorite of the 2, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, published in 2004, which was nominated for all the awards, won the Hugo and the Man Book Award, and was named Time's Best Novel of the Year. This is a chunky book, almost 800 pages, and filled with footnotes. The writing is literary, gothic, dense, so it probably isn't for everyone. Maybe read the first chapter to make sure it's for you, but if it is, you're in for a treat. The story is an alternate history novel of 19th century England where magic exists, but magic is super rare and almost never actually is used, just studied by scholars. That is until one of the most notable scholars, Mr. Norrell, wants to revive the actual practice of respectable magic. But then a young upstart comes on the scene named Jonathan Strange, who is not afraid to use magic. The 2 figures are destined to meet as enemies, as friends. Their world is next to the world of the Fae, led by the Raven King, and the backdrop is the Napoleonic Wars, which are threatening all of England. Clark's second novel, Piranesi, is a much different and shorter epistolary novel with an unreliable narrator. Basically, it's the diary of a man who lives in a dimension that is just one big house with no other inhabitants. Piranesi is a very interesting and unique book to read, but in my opinion, it's nowhere near as momentous as Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which I view as a masterpiece. I am a little pissed off at this next author, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but I am referring to James Clemens. That's the pen name of an author who is much better known by another pen name, James Rollins. He was born in 1961, and like I said, he is much, much more famous under the name James Rollins for his thriller, action-adventure novels, and those novels sell very, very well. Obviously, he also loves high fantasy because he wrote the series The Banned and the Banished under the name James Clemens. Now, this 5-book series starts with Witchfire, published in 1998. I loved the entire series. It's about a girl named Elena who is born with powers that may challenge the Dark Lord, and she sets off on a quest surrounded by a motley crew of outcasts. And I know it sounds like a typical tropey, chosen one fantasy story, and it is. But it is so well written and plotted, I could not put the series down. It is dark, disturbing. Elena is a main character you can't help but fall in love with, and you really find yourself worried about her when she gets into situations that are really difficult to get out of. This is so good. I can't recommend it enough to anyone who likes epic fantasy. And that's the only thing I can recommend by James Clemens because it's the only series he completed. He started another fantasy series called the God Slayer series. There's 2 books out, one published in 2005 and one in 2006. I, of course, got them. I really got into them, and it ends on a cliffhanger, and there's never going to be another one published. The series was abandoned. That's why I was so pissed off at James Clemens. I think it could have been up there with Brandon Sanderson. He's that good, but he stopped. Obviously, something happened with him and the publisher. I don't know quite what. And obviously, he can make much more money publishing thrillers as James Rollins, so I can't really fault him for it, but damn it, I can't help but be angry for what could have been. Okay, the last author for this segment is Alan Cole. Now, this gets a little dicey because the series I'm recommending was written by a collaboration between Alan Cole and Chris Bunch. But I decided to list it under Alan Cole simply because Cole lived longer and wrote the last novel in the series I want to talk about. They were both born in 1943, Bunch died in 2005 at the age of 61, while Cole died in 2019 at the age of 75. And interestingly enough, they were related by marriage. Cole married Chris Bunch's sister. Anyway, they collaborated on a very long-running science fiction series called The Sten Chronicles, but my favorite is their fantasy series of Anteros. The first novel is The Far Kingdoms, published in 1985, where we meet Amalric Anteros, who is a pampered merchant who meets Janos Greycloak, who is a soldier and a magician who claims to know the way to the land of riches and is basically a big old treasure hunt adventure. It's a lot of fun, and it's pretty much a standalone novel because the second novel was written almost 10 years later with The Warrior's Tale, published in 1994. And this is the one I really recommend. It's a story about Amalric's sister, Captain Raleigh Antero, probably the best sapphic high fantasy story I've ever read. Raleigh leads an all-female company of soldiers as they track down the last Archon of Lycans, who holds a doomsday spell that can destroy everyone. The third book in the Antero series is Kingdoms of Night, where we go back to Amalric. And the fourth book, The Return of the Warrior, is a Captain Raleigh adventure where she returns after being thought dead. And this novel was written solely by Alan Cole. All these novels are pretty much standalone stories. You don't need to read them in order. But I think the standouts are the ones with the lesbian heroine, Captain Raleigh. We start with Glen Cook, born in 1944, who published short stories and novels throughout the 70s, but he broke out with The Black Company, published in 1984, the first in a series of novels known as The Black Company. I suggest the first three: Black Company, Shadows Linger, and White Rose. They are about a company of mercenary soldiers who are not very nice guys, except they are loyal to one another, and they work for some brutal overlords. The world they live in is dark and gritty, where might makes right, and dark magic is everywhere. The story is told from the point of view of the company's doctor and historian, Croker. Eventually, the Black Company is employed by the Lady, a dark sorceress with an agenda. I read this in the 80s when I was playing D&D, and it was recommended by my dungeon master, and I am sure these books influenced a lot of D&D players, especially back in the 80s. If you like your fantasy dark, I think you can't go wrong with The Black Company by Glen Cook. Zoraida Córdova was born in Ecuador and came to America as a young child. She has written young adult, middle grade, and romance, and even some Star Wars novels. But the one I want to talk about is The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina, published in 2021. It was a shelve it or shove it pick, and I was enthralled. This is a contemporary fantasy about Orquídea Divina, the matriarch of the Montoya family. They live somewhere in the United States in the town of Four Rivers. Orquídea never leaves her property, and when she dies, she turns into a tree. Now, the family isn't as shocked as you might expect because they've grown up around Orquídea's magic. Not that they trust the magic, or not that they even trust her, but the story is about her family members coming together and uncovering the mystery of Orquídea Divina. The writing, for me, often has this feel of magical realism, but there's way too much magic to really call it that. This is one of my favorite contemporary fantasies, and it's perfect for anyone who likes complicated family dramas, not with a splash of magic, but getting doused and drenched in magic. Sunyi Dean was born in Texas, grew up in Hong Kong, and now lives in England. Her debut novel is The Book Eaters, published in 2022. It's a bit of a genre blend that falls somewhere between contemporary fantasy and gothic horror. It introduces a new type of supernatural creature, which is a hard thing to do, but they're called the Book Eaters, and book eaters can unhinge their jaws and eat books and absorb the contents of the books, the knowledge. Are they biological alien probes? Not even book eaters know. Their society is very insulated, and because they are slow to reproduce, they treat women like chattel. Devon is one of these women book eaters who literally grew up on fairy tales and now finds life isn't what she imagined, and she is forced into this awful situation where she has to have children and then give them up. For me, this novel divides kind of into two parts. The first half reads like an intriguing Gothic fantasy, and the last half is a mile-a-minute horror thriller. The book was shortlisted for the Lambda Awards. Yes, there's a sapphic element, and also the British Fantasy Awards. If you're looking for something dark and different, check out The Book Eaters by Sunyi Dean. Sara Douglass is an Australian fantasy author who was born in 1957 and died way too young in 2011 at the age of 54. She's one of my favorite authors, and I've read a ton of her novels, starting with The Wayfarer, Redemption, published in 1995, the first novel in the Axis trilogy. It was originally published in Australia under the title Battle Axe. These are great books. I love them, but the series I want to recommend is The Troy Game. It's a quartet of books that starts with Hades' Daughter, published in 2002. Now, Douglass has a PhD in English history, and she put it to good use in this series. Now, Hades' Daughter starts in ancient Greece, where several individuals become entangled in a magical rite and are destined to be reborn again and again until this rite, this magic, is resolved. So the second book, God's Concubine, the main characters are reincarnated as Greeks who are colonizing Britain. And then their story gets intertwined in the magics of Britain. The next book, Dark Witch Rising, they're born into Restoration London during Charles II's reign. And finally, the conclusion, Druid's Sword, the characters are reincarnated just in time for World War II. It's an amazing epic that, in my opinion, deserves much more attention than it got. Dave Duncan is a Canadian author born in Scotland in 1933 and died in 2018 at the age of 85. He was a prolific writer, publishing over 50 books. He's one of those dependable fantasy authors that when you pick up one of his books, you know you're going to be in for a good time. My recommendation is a duology that starts with Children of Chaos, published in 2006, and ends with Mother of Lies, published in 2007. The story is about 4 children who are given up as hostages for the peace of a kingdom. When their father dies, one of them must become the puppet ruler, and the rest of them have to be killed off. Again, this is dependable, edge-of-your-seat, solid fantasy. And if you're looking for pure escapism, you can't go wrong with any book written by Dave Duncan. Ruthanna Emrys does what I love to see in modern stories inspired by the Lovecraft mythos: turn the mythos on its head. We've seen that done before with Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff and The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, but I'd argue that Ruthanna Emrys does it best with Winter's Tide, published in 2017. This novel was shortlisted for the Crawford Award and finalist for the Locus Award and finalist for the Mythopoeic Fantasy Award. Did I pronounce that right? You don't have to know anything about the Lovecraft mythos to enjoy Winter's Tide, but it helps. It takes the Lovecraft story, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and turns it on its head. In the Lovecraft story, the human hybrids known as the Deep Ones are alien monsters out to destroy humanity. In Emrys' story, the Deep One hybrids, who look mostly human, are the victims. They're rounded up during World War II and put in internment camps along with Japanese Americans. Now, a personal aside, my mother was in one of those internment camps when she was a little girl. Anyway, the story is about 2 Deep One siblings, Afra and Caleb, who live with a Japanese-American family after the war and think they are the only ones left and their heritage has been lost. That is, until the FBI shows up with an offer. Here, we have to wonder who are the true monsters. There's a sequel that is also excellent, published in 2018 called Deep Roots, and together the series is known as the Innsmouth Legacy, and I highly recommend both books. Everyone who reads fantasy these days at least knows the name of Stephen Erikson, the Canadian novelist born in 1959, who came to fame in a rather big way with the first novel in the Malazan series, Gardens of the Moon, published in 1999. Some of you may be surprised he's on this list because I've been quite public that I could not finish the series. I got up to The Toll of Hounds, which is book 8 of a 10-book series, and I couldn't get through it. As the series progressed, it felt like every book got denser and denser, and eventually I just got bogged down. Maybe it was because I was reading them back to back. Maybe it would have been better to take a break between books. I don't know. Maybe I'll come back and finish the series because I'm pretty close, but I understand why people love it. It is based on a role-playing game that Erikson created with Ian Eselmont, who has also written books in the Malazan world. They did an amazing job at world building, creating this complex, intricate, rich world with different types of magic systems and characters. And I have to acknowledge that Erikson's writing is amazing. Literary, epic, so epic. There are tons of points of views and twists and turns. He's got to be on this list. I highly recommend Gardens of the Moon and maybe the next 2 books in the sequel. After that, I suggest you kind of slow down and maybe take it easy because, like I said, the stories get denser and denser. David Farland is the pseudonym for David Wolverton, who was born in 1957 and died in 2022 at the age of 64. He was published under both names, but the series I want to talk about is under the Farland pseudonym, the Rune Lord series, which starts with a novel first published in 1998 under the title The Sum of All Men, but it's now being published under the name The Rune Lords. This is another super long series, but unlike Erikson's Malazan series, Farland series is much more accessible, in my opinion. Also, I think the first 3 books constitutes a complete trilogy, so you don't need to read more after that, but be my guest if you want to. There is an interesting magical system where you can transfer an attribute of a person to another person, and it could be brawn or grace or wit. And someone who gets a lot of attributes from other people becomes a Rune Lord, and they're sort of this superhuman being. That is, unless you kill off the people who gave them attributes, in which case the Rune Lord begins losing his or her power. Are you into unique magic systems, a fan of Brandon Sanderson? Then be sure to check out David Farland's Rune Lords. Raymond Feist was born in 1945 and is still active today. His novels are based on a role-playing game he created with his friends called Midkemia, which is meant to be an alternative to Dungeons & Dragons, kind of like what Stephen Erikson did with Malazan. And like Erikson, Feist used the world building as the basis for his novel Magician, published in 1982. Now, I have kind of a very tangential connection to Feist. I was a producer for an online text game who licensed Midkemia, what they called Midkemia Online. It's not available anymore, but it was overseen by another producer who worked under me and I trained up. Anywho, Magician is now split into 2 books, Magician Apprentice and Magician Master. It came out during what I call the fantasy renaissance that began with Sword of Shannara. It's an epic that starts with the traditional fantasy trope of an orphan, this time a boy named Pug, who grows up in the kitchens of the king's castle. Eventually he becomes apprenticed to a magician and comes of age during a time when a rift has opened up from another dimension. There are a lot of familiar elements you find in epic fantasy, like elves and dwarves, but a few twists, like rifts to another dimension. There are now a ton of books set in Midkemia, but the Rift War saga is a complete storyline. If you want more, maybe my favorite in this world is the Empire trilogy that starts with Daughter of the Empire, published in 1987, co-written with Janny Wirtz. Finally, we end this group of fantasy writers with Lynn Flewelling, born in 1958 and is pretty well known for their LGBT fantasy Night Runner series that started with her debut, Luck in the Shadows, published in 1996. But the series I really want to recommend is a trilogy known as the Tamir Triad that starts with The Bone Dolls Twin, published in 2001. Oh my gosh, this book is so good. And it's kind of the ultimate fantasy for a trans person. In the Queendom of Scala, the half-brother of the queen usurps the throne and murders all the women of the line who can have a claim, and this is also to thwart a prophecy. Well, Tobin is the son of the king's sister, so he's safe because he's a boy. Except as he grows up, he starts seeing the ghost of his twin and doesn't feel as though he was born in the right body. I don't know why this book didn't win awards or get more acclaim. Other fantasy writers certainly recognized its greatness, including George R.R. Martin and Robin Hobb. Run, don't walk to at least read the first novel in this amazing trilogy, The Bone Dolls Twin by Lynn Flewelling. Our first author is British fantasy author Neil Gaiman, born in 1960. Now, full disclosure, as of this filming, there have been allegations of inappropriate behavior against Gaiman. I haven't really done a deep dive research into the allegations, but as of right now, in this moment in time, I am able to separate the art from the artist. That may change in the future, but you should do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Anyway, Gaiman came onto the scene in comic books as a writer of Sandman, one of the most amazing comics ever. In my opinion, I started reading Sandman when issue 1 came out in 1989. I have a lot of the original comics from the 80s and 90s. It has been adapted into an amazing and surprisingly accurate series on Netflix. But after comics, Gaiman turned to writing fantasy novels, including Good Omens, published in 1990, where he collaborated with Terry Pratchett. It's a hilarious book, though. I think the humor is more Pratchett than Gaiman. Oh, and by the way, it's an even more amazing audiobook experience than reading. But the book I want to recommend is American Gods, published in 2001, which won both the Hugo and the Nebula. In this contemporary fantasy, gods exist, and their power comes from the belief of humans. Since America is a melting pot, gods from other cultures have immigrated here, and new gods arise like the goddess of media and Technical Boy, the god of technology. The story is about a man named Shadow who is caught up in the war between new gods and old gods. I think it is one of the best contemporary fantasy novels I've ever read to date. The next author is another British author, Mary Gentle, born in 1956. Her first novel, A Hawk in Silver, which appears to be a young adult fantasy novel. I couldn't find out much about it. I started reading Gentle with her science fiction novel, Golden Witchbreed, published in 1984, the first in a duology. Her 2000 novel, Ash, A Secret History, won the Sidewise Award for Alternate History and the British Science Fiction Association Award. But I want to talk about her fantasy novel, Grunts, published in 1992. This is one of the most hilarious parodies of traditional fantasies ever. I'd put it up there with Terry Pratchett, but it's a black comedy satire about a group of orcs who live in a hyper-typical Lord of the Rings type fantasy realm where they serve a Dark Lord who is besieged by the forces of good. Somehow, they find a cache of weapons in a dragon's hoard. Somehow, these weapons were from another time and dimension. In fact, they are the modern military weapons of the United States Marine Corps. The more the orcs use the weapons, the more they turn into this stereotypical Rambo-type Marines. The book is hilarious, over the top. Maybe it's a little bit too long, but I think it is well worth the read. Let's talk about Terry Goodkin, born in 1948 and died in 2020 at the age of 72. Goodkin had dyslexia and didn't do very well in school, so he never went to a higher education, and allegedly had little interest in writing, becoming a woodworker and an artist, but he eventually did write a book. And his first novel is Wizard's First Rule, published in 1993, and became the first in a 16-book series of blockbuster novels called the Sword of Truth series, most of which were New York Times bestsellers. Now, Goodkin was a libertarian, and some libertarian philosophy was reflected in the books. It didn't bother me at all, but your mileage may vary. I did stop reading about halfway through the series. I think I got up to Pillars of Creation, Book 7, but the series is broken up into story arcs. Wizard's First Rule is part of a 2-part story arc, and that's what I recommend you start with. The second story arc is contained in the next 4 books. Wizard's First Rule is about Richard Cypher, who saves a woman named Kaylin from assassins. Kaylin is a mother confessor who has this magic power to force people to tell the truth. She is searching for the first wizard, who happens to be Richard's mentor, Old Zed. They must defeat the encroaching empire run by Darken Rule. Oh, do you want to know what the first rule is that allows wizards to manipulate the masses? The first rule is, people are stupid. They'll believe anything. The Sword of Truth was adapted to a science fiction series, which I'll say is mediocre, and that's being very, very kind. It only lasted 1 season. Lev Grossman was born in 1969 and was a successful journalist before he was a novelist, writing for New York Times, The Village Voice, Wall Street Journal, and so on. He also has an identical twin brother who also became a novelist, a guy named Austin Grossman. Lev Grossman published a few novels I've never heard of, but he hit it big with The Magicians, published in 2009. I love this book a lot. It is a contemporary fantasy that completely subverts children's portal fantasies, especially Narnia, and also subverts the magic school trope. It is about Quentin Coldwater, who has been obsessed all his life with the children's portal fantasy Fillory and Further, kind of like how some of us could be obsessed with Narnia. And to Quentin's surprise, he is recruited to a magical college called Brakebills, where he discovers magic is real, and so too is the magic kingdom of Fillory, but maybe not quite what he expects now that he's seeing it through the eyes of an adult. And there are some very adult themes in The Magician, so check out trigger warnings if that's something important to you. Now, I don't believe that The Magicians was meant to be a series. I think it was always meant to be a standalone, so you don't really need to go beyond that, but Grossman did write 2 more sequels, The Magician's King in 2011 and The Magician's Land in 2014. The Sci-Fi Channel adapted it to what I think is a really amazing series in 2015 that lasted 5 seasons, so honestly, maybe it went on a season or 2 too long, but I think it is also worth checking out. Elizabeth Haydon was born in 1965. I can't find out much about her, but I fell in love with her first trilogy, In the Symphony of Ages world. It starts with Rhapsody, Child of Blood, published in 1999. Rhapsody is a woman who is a namer, who basically can only speak the truth, and she's a singer, basically a good old-fashioned Dungeons & Dragons bard, since her music is magic. She teams up with Ahmed, an assassin, and Grunther, a bodyguard warrior soldier. They find themselves on the run from a demon and must unite the various races of the land. I really enjoyed the first trilogy, and there are more books after, but I recommend the original trilogy. It's a solid fantasy series, and one of the only ones where a bard is the main character, which should really appeal to some D&D enthusiasts. Okay, the next author is one of my top favorite fantasy authors of all time, Robin Hobb, born in 1952. Now, when her first novel in the realm of the Elderlings world was published in 1995, titled Assassin's Apprentice, It seemed like the author came out of nowhere, but that's because she had published over 10 novels under a different pseudonym, Megan Lindholm. So Robin Hobb was already a seasoned writer when Assassin's Apprentice came out, and that's when I started reading her. Now, I thought the first trilogy, the Farseer trilogy, was solid. It's about the bastard son of the king named Fitz, who is trained as an assassin. He has 2 types of magic powers. One is the respectable power of the skill, which is a form of telepathy and mind power, and the disreputable and reviled magic of the wit, where people can bond psychically with animals. Throughout the trilogy, Fitz is treated pretty poorly by the kingdom, but somehow retains a sense of honor and duty. Oh, and we get introduced to the Fool, who is a strange albino, maybe, type character who seems magical and wise, but also maybe a little bit insane, who's the king's advisor, and becomes a close friend to Fitz. Now, the great thing about the realm of the Elderlings is that this world that Robin Hobb had created is not a 14-book series like Wheel of Time or Song of Fire and Ice or Malazan or whatever. What Hobb does is she keeps returning to the world telling different stories with completely different characters. For example, the second trilogy, you can totally read without reading the prior one, The Live Ship Traders, which starts with The Ship of Magic, where she introduces sentient ships. I know that sounds bizarre, but by the end, it completely fits in with the world in a way that will shock you. I think each series in the realm of the Elderling seems to get better and better than the one before it, with maybe the Rainwild Chronicles as an exception, but I even love that one. The very last trilogy, The Fitz and the Fool, that starts with Fool's Assassin, written in 2014, 20 years after the Farseer trilogy, reflects how Robin Hobb has matured as a writer and as a human being, because we return to 2 of the characters we've grown up with in earlier series, Fitz and the Fool, when they're much more mature, and they set off on an adventure which literally had me crying at the end. I mean, I might occasionally tear up when reading a book, but this one actually made me cry. James Islington is an Australian fantasy author born in 1981. His novel, The Shadow of What Was Lost, was published in 2014, and it's the first book in the Lycanius trilogy, which I thought was excellent. In fact, if you are into audiobooks, I highly recommend the audiobook series. It is amazing. Now, what makes the Lycanius trilogy unique for fantasy is its exploration into time travel, which usually you only find in science fiction. And I'm a little picky when it comes to time travel stories because paradoxes annoy me, but the way Islington deals with time travel really works here. And the story and writing is so good. In the kingdom of Andara, a young man named Davian learns he is an augur, meaning he has many innate magical powers that are illegal and dangerous, like manipulating time. He goes on the run with his best friend, Wur, escaping a school that was supposed to be training them. Then everyone at the school is massacred except for their friend, Asha. The plot becomes really tangled in a good way as we work out what is really happening in this truly epic fantasy story where time is malleable. We have to talk about the great British fantasy author Diana Wynne Jones, born in 1934 and died in 2011 at the age of 76. Most of her books are children's books, so her first novel, Changeover, published in 1970, was an adult novel. You probably know at least one of her works, Howl's Moving Castle, published in 1986, which was adapted into the great anime movie Howl's Moving Castle by Miyazaki in 2004. Spoiler, the novel is much different than the movie. Diana Wynne Jones wrote dozens of books for children, but my favorites are the Chrestomanci books. The first of which is Charmed Life, published in 1977. It's about 2 children, Gwendolyn and Eric, whose parents die, and because of Gwendolyn's magic powers, they are raised in Chrestomanci Castle, where the powerful enchanter Chrestomanci can train Gwendolyn. But Gwendolyn is a piece of work and turns out to be the true villain of the story, much to her brother's dismay. Throughout Diana Wynne Jones's career, she kept going back to chrestomancy, publishing 6 novels in total over a 30-year period. You know this next author is going to be on this list. Why am I doing this? I don't know. But I'm talking about Robert Jordan, born in 1948 and died in 2007 at the age of 58 from a rare form of heart disease. He began his career writing Conan novels. In fact, he wrote a total of 7 novels in a 2-year period, which is kind of amazing. But of course, everyone knows his magnum opus, Wheel of Time. The series starts with Eye of the World, published in 1990. That's when I started reading him. And I have to point out that reading The Wheel of Time as it was published, meaning you only got to read 1 book a year, is a lot different than someone now who picks up the series and is looking at a massive collection of 14 books. But at the time, it was a big event when the novels came out because, at least for me, a lot of my friends were also reading the series and we talked about it. Unfortunately, Jordan died before he could finish the series, but before he died, he hand-selected the author who would complete the story, and that author was Brandon Sanderson, who wrote the last 3 books of the series. Now, I'm a fan of Sanderson. I love The Mistborn and Stormlight Archives, but don't hate me for saying this, but I thought his Wheel of Time books didn't have the same magic that Robert Jordan's did, especially with regards to the characterizations. But at least the series is complete. It tells the story of 5 young people from the small town of Two Rivers, Rand, Matt, Perrin, Egwene, and Nynaeve. Their friendship is so true and strong that it basically enables them to defeat the great darkness that is awakening, even though they get split up as the truly epic story unfolds. The world building is incredible. The Aes Sedai, the Forsaken, the Taint. I can't get enough. There is an Amazon Prime adaptation, which I personally think the writers or showrunners or whoever is in charge doesn't really like the original story because it's been so heavily modified. But hey, I know some people have really enjoyed it. Our last writer in this group of 10 is Guy Gavriel Kay, the Canadian fantasy writer born in 1954. I consider Kay a literary fantasy writer. What is literary writing? For me, it's when the prose is so elevated or beautiful or striking that it transcends the average written word. Kay's first novel, The Summer Tree, published in 1984, is the first book in a trilogy. It's a portal fantasy for adults, kind of like The Magicians by Lev Grossman. And that trilogy is probably the closest to typical fantasy that Guy Gavriel Kay has written. After that, he wrote several standalone novels that I think are amazing and draw richly from history, though he does not consider any of his works historical fantasy. Tigana, published in 1990, draws inspiration from Renaissance Italy. A Song for Arbonne, published in 1992, draws from medieval Provence. But my favorite is a duology called the Sarantine Mosaic, the first of which is Sailing to Sarantium, published in 1998, drawing inspiration from the Byzantine Empire. The story is about Caius Crispus, who is an artist who creates mosaics. A mosaicist? Anyway, Crispin gets caught up in the political intrigue of a childless emperor and a queen of a small kingdom who's trying to survive, who uses Crispin as a go-between. The fantasy element here is really thin. Like several of Kay's works, the fantasy is almost invisible, kind of reminding me of Maya by Richard Adams, which I talked about early in this series, where you even forget you are reading a fantasy. Today we are starting with a children's author, Tay Keller, who was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, and graduated from Bryn Mawr College in 2015. Her debut novel was The Science of Breakable Things, published in 2018, but her next novel is what really made her famous and the one I recommend. When You Trap a Tiger was published in 2020 and went on to win the Newbery Medal, which is the most prestigious Children's Award. It lives in that really nebulous subgenre of fantasy called magical realism, where magic can maybe be seen just out of the corner of your eye. Maybe it exists, it probably exists, but maybe it doesn't. The story is about a girl named Lily who mysteriously sees a tiger that no one else can see. When Lily and her mother and sister move in to live with her Korean grandmother, we learn about the role of tigers in Korean folktales. And could her grandmother's failing health be connected with something her grandmother did to the tigers? I wanted to include this children's book on this list because it actually did make me cry. I think it's a really moving and special book. So we're going to make a 180-degree turn away from children's books because the next author is Stephen King. King is the megastar author I'm sure you must know if you read any books at all. He was born in 1947 and his debut novel Carrie was published in 1974 and became a bestseller, establishing King as the king of horror. So, why am I including King in a list of fantasy authors? Honestly, I think many of his works could be science fiction, especially those that deal with one of sci-fi's perennial favorites, psychic powers like Firestarter and Dead Zone, and yes, maybe even Carrie. That's the thing about speculative fiction. There can be a lot of overlapping or blending of genres and subgenres among science fiction, fantasy, and horror. That's to say that my favorite King books are what I consider contemporary dark fantasy, namely the Dark Tower series, which started with The Gunslinger, published in 1982, and ends with The Dark Tower, published in 2004. There are 7 novels in the main series, and there's also an 8th book published in 2012 that comes in the middle of the series called The Wind Through the Keyhole, which I don't think you really need to read, but why not? Anyway, the story is about a gunslinger, basically an old-fashioned Clint Eastwood spaghetti western type cowboy named Roland of Gilead, who is chasing his nemesis, the Man in Black, through this weird, twisted dimension or reality that is, well, it feels post-apocalyptic. It's definitely seen better days. And Roland meets up with a human boy named Jake from our world, from New York City, who has somehow stumbled into this nightmare realm. King was inspired by the Robert Browning poem, Child Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which he read as a sophomore in college. I think this is King's magnum opus. I used to think it was a stand, but after reading the entire Dark Tower series, I believe this is his greatest work, at least to date. After all, he is still writing. Oh, I am so excited for this next author because she is my new favorite fantasy author. T. Kingfisher is a pseudonym of Ursula Vernon, born in 1977, who first published under her own name as a children's author, notably the series Dragon Breath and Hamster Princess. When she began publishing adult works, she adopted the name T. Kingfisher to differentiate her children's and adult fiction. And she came out swinging in adult fantasy, winning both the Hugo and Nebula. I love her work. Even her children's fiction as Ursula Vernon is worth checking out. Look up Castle Hangnail, a really funny and adorable story about a little girl who decides to become a wicked witch. But as T. Kingfisher, I like all her books so much. It's hard to choose just one to recommend. But I think I'm going to go with Nettle and Bone, which won the Hugo, Nebula, and Locust. It's a dark fairy tale that takes the fairy godmother figure and raises her to new heights. It's about a princess named Mara, who is the youngest of 3 sisters. When her older sister is shipped off to marry an abusive king, Mara decides to take action. What's really amazing is the writing. Kingfisher retains that whimsical, rich, humorous voice that she developed as a children's author and uses it to tell really dark and disturbing tales. I love it. T.J. Klune is another author who has a whimsical writing voice. Klune was born in 1982, and his first novel, Bear, Otter, and the Kid, was published in 2011 about a gay couple raising a child. Klune identifies as asexual and writes mostly in the LGBTQIA space, but his novels have broken into the mainstream, starting with my recommendation, House in the Cerulean Sea, published in 2020. This is a story about Linus Baker, a sort of dumpy man who works for the department in charge of magical youth. So, yes, this is a contemporary fantasy where magic is known, though maybe not respected, certainly not for the children who live in an orphanage, which is the House in the Cerulean Sea. Linus is assigned to investigate, and the people he finds and the relationships he forms changes his life. It's a wonderful, whimsical story. I think we can call it a cozy, and it went on to become a bestseller. This is another one of those I bet you never heard of authors, and that is Elise Kova. Now, I know I've said I'm not a big fan of romantasy, the romance fantasy mashup, but there's always exceptions, and that's why I'm including Elise Kova with her Air Awakens young adult fantasy series that starts with Air Awakens, published in 2015. Well before romantasy was even a term used for the fantasy romance subgenre, I bought it just as a fantasy book, but if you are a romantasy fan, run, don't walk to the Air Awakens books. It's about a young woman who is the ultimate bookworm. She is the apprentice to a librarian, and the Solaris Empire may be conquering the world around her, but at least she has her own little quiet life among books. That is until she unknowingly saves the life of the Crown Prince, who also happens to be a powerful sorcerer. And it is discovered that she possesses rare elemental magic. This is a very readable, somewhat typical, but super fun series. One of the recent big hitters in the world of fantasy is R.F. Kuang. Born in China in 1996, Kuang is one of the most educated authors you'll ever find, with degrees from Cambridge, Oxford, and Yale. Her debut novel, The Poppy Wars, published in 2018, is the first in a trilogy of an amazing anti-hero story set in a fantasy world based on the Second Sino-Japanese War. But the book I recommend, which blew me away, is Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an Arcane History of the Oxford Translators' Revolution, published in 2022. It went on to win many awards, including the Nebula. I think it would have won the Hugo if there wasn't some shenanigans in the Hugo Awards that year. Anyway, it is an alternate history of the 1830s where magic is a real and exploited system based on silver bars and languages. It is a really interesting magic system. The story is about a half-Chinese, half-English boy named Robin who finds himself caught between two worlds during the Opium Wars between Britain and China. This was my top book of the year for 2022, and one that I think should become a classic. Oh, now we have to talk about Mercedes Lackey, who is one of the most prolific fantasy authors ever. Born in 1950, Lackey writes 5.5 books a year and has published over 140 novels. In 2021, she was named the Damon Knight Grandmaster, the Lifetime Achievement Honor from the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. I have read a ton of Mercedes Lackey books, mostly based in the world of Valdemar, where chosen people bond with magic horses called companions and gain special powers. My favorite books are the last Herald Mage books, whose main character, Vaniel, is a gay mage. This was published in 1989, well before there was really any such thing as gay mainstream fantasy. But if you're just getting into the world of Valdemar, I think you should start with Arrows of the Queen, published in 1987, the first Valdemar book, and first in a trilogy known as the Arrows Trilogy. It introduces the world of Valdemar through the main character Talia, who is unexpectedly chosen by a companion horse named Roland. Then she and Roland make their way to become the Queen's own herald. These are fast fantasy reads where you'll find out why Mercedes Lackey is what I think of as the queen of plotting and pacing. Fonda Lee was born in Canada in 1979 and has written one of my favorite trilogies ever, the Green Bones Saga, which starts with Jade City, published in 2017. The world building is unique because the technology level is around the 1970s, which is pretty unusual for fantasy. But what I think is really impressive is that these novels are metaphors for the Cold War. Not from the viewpoint of one of the major powers, but one of the smaller nations caught in the constant escalation of conflict between the two major powers. However, in this world, the nation of Kacen, there's something that makes them unique, which no one else in the world has, the magic power of Jade. Jade grants superhuman powers, but only to those of a certain bloodline. The story is about one of the family clans, the No Peak clan, who is in perpetual conflict with the Mountain clan and have divided Kacen into two zones. The clans are kind of sort of mafia-type organizations, only they are not crime lords since nothing they do is illegal, but it does raise the question of the legitimacy of might makes right, even if they strive to be honorable. This is also one of those rare generational stories that you don't usually find in fantasies, at least not in the same storyline. I can't say enough good things about the Green Bones Saga, and you should definitely check it out if you haven't. It's also one of those books that makes me wonder, why hasn't there been a series or a movie based on it yet, because it is so perfect for an adaptation. Let's go old school with the Hugo Award-winning author. I'm talking about Fritz Leiber, born in 1910. And I'm not including him just because I'm friends with someone who was his assistant. Hey, Lee. Leiber is a Golden Age author, writing mainly in the pulp magazines in the 30s and 40s, writing a lot of Lovecraft-inspired horror. His father was an actor also named Fritz Leiber, and people would later mix up the two, especially since the author Fritz Leiber did do some acting, having grown up in an acting family. Like a lot of the Golden Age writers, he mostly focused on short stories because you could make more money writing short stories in those days. If you are into fantasy, you've probably heard of his Vafford and Grey Mouser stories, which are several volumes of short stories about this pair of Conan-type rogues or adventurers. But the book I want to recommend is one of his weird ones, Conjure Wife, published in 1943. I don't think this novel could be published today, and I'm sure many people who pick it up would go, what? But it is, I guess I'd call it a contemporary fantasy horror, contemporary for the 1940s, because it is the ultimate men's paranoia story. There is this vast conspiracy that secretly women control everything and pretend to let men think they're in control because naturally women are witches. The story is about a young couple, Norman and Tansy. Norman is an up-and-coming sociology professor who finds out his wife is practicing witchcraft. He makes her stop, and then immediately his life unravels because she has been secretly protecting him and advancing his career. I think this is such a unique novel for the time it was written. And by the way, there have been several movie adaptations, the last of which was in 1980 with the movie Witch's Brew starring Terry Garr. In 2019, it also won the Retro Hugo for Best Novel of 1944. We started with a children's author, and we're going to end with a children's author, C.S. Lewis, who is probably my favorite children's author when I was growing up. because he wrote the Narnia series, starting with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, published in 1950. Lewis was born in 1898 and died in 1963 at the age of 64. He was a contemporary of J.R.R. Tolkien. In fact, both authors were in the same writing group known as the Inklings. If you don't know, the Narnia books are about children traveling to the fantasy world of Narnia, the first time through a wardrobe, making Narnia one of the templates for portal fantasies. My first introduction to Narnia was not through the books. I was in second grade when the high school kids put on a production of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I was obsessed. I remember seeing the high school actress who played the White Witch after the show, and I pointed at her and screamed, "Witch!" I'm sure she's probably still telling that story today. Yes, C.S. Lewis is also a Christian philosopher, and there are a lot of Christian themes in the books. I mean, you meet Santa Claus at one point, but I never really picked up on that as a kid. There are a total of 7 Narnia books, which were written in a 6-year period. Of all the Narnia books, my favorite may be The Magician's Nephew, which chronologically is the first book in the series and tells about the creation of Narnia. My least favorite, and everyone's least favorite, is The Last Battle, which is about the end of Narnia, where everyone dies. Yes, it's a children's book about the eschaton. We are starting with Holly Lyle, who was born in 1960, and I just found out she died a few weeks ago, just shy of her 64th birthday. And yeah, I am in kind of shock. Lyle is what I think of as an author's author. She should be much more well-known, I think. But again, she's another of those writers who never really took off. But she wrote a lot about how to write and offered tons of advice to writers, eventually putting together some really great writing courses. So it's really a loss to the writing community that she's passed away. Her debut novel was First in the Mist, published in 1991, which is the first book in the Arhel trilogy, which won the Compton Award. But what I recommend is the Secret Text trilogy, which starts with Diplomacy of Wolves, published in 1998. I personally don't think the cover and title did justice to the story about Kate Galway, a woman who is a diplomat to the great house of Galway. She uncovers a plot to kill her family and has to decide whether or not to use a secret weapon. Speaking of secrets, Kate has a secret that absolutely no one can find out. What I love about this book is the world building, which is really deep and full of surprises, and the plotting, which is what I think Lyle is a master of, and those are 2 things she is known for as a writing teacher. Rest in peace, Holly. Scott Lynch was born in 1978, and his debut novel, The Lives of Locke Lamora, was a huge success when it came out in 2006. It is about a pair of con artists, Locke Lamora, who is a mastermind, and Gene Tannen, who is more of a strongman. And they are both members of the Gentlemen Bastards, a group of confidence tricksters. The setting is inspired by medieval Venice, and they fight against the mysterious Grey King who is taking over the criminal underworld. Even though the story is pretty grim, and there are a lot of dark magic and mysteries woven throughout, the amazing part about this book is the writing voice, the style. It is so cheeky and rich and deep. I think it's one of the most amazing fantasy voices I've ever read, up there with Patrick Rothfuss. It is the first part of a series that continues with Red Seas Under Red Skies, published in 2007, and The Republic of Thieves, published in 2013. So the last book was over 10 years ago, and there are supposed to be several more books in the series. So Lynch is suffering from a case of George R.R. Martindom. But even so, just to get a taste of that wonderful and unique writing style, I highly recommend The Lives of Locke Lamora. You cannot be a fantasy reader without at least knowing the name of Sarah J. Maas. She was born in 1986 and has become one of the most successful fantasy authors of modern times. She started writing the novel that would become her debut at the age of 16, that is, Throne of Glass. It wasn't finished until 10 years later in 2012, and it was an instant success. But I want to talk about the first novel in one of her biggest series, A Court of Thorns and Roses, published in 2015. Now, what I think is interesting is that Maas is known as a young adult novelist, and this was marketed as young adult. But the main character, Feyre, was young, but not that young. She's 19, and normally young adult, the protagonists are under 18. This woman, Feyre, slays a wolf, being in the wrong place in the wrong time, and is punished by a Fey Lord, Tamlin. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and it is dark and spicy. It really leans in hard on romance subplots like hate to love and lovers' triangles. And guess what? Even though I usually don't read romantices, I enjoyed this novel and recommend it for those who enjoy romantices. But what I think is really interesting is as the series progressed, it eventually stopped being marketed as young adult and moved into the adult market, or new adult, which I think is a stupid category. But I can't think of any series that shifted age categories midway in. You know, I have to include at least one children's author in these lists. So how about Tahira Mafi, an Iranian author born in 1988? Mafi debuted with Shatter Me in 2011, a young adult dystopian thriller. But I want to talk about her middle grade series, which starts with Furthermore, published in 2016. This is so much fun. It's as if a denizen of Wonderland goes through a portal to an even weirder Wonderland. The main character is Alice Alexis Queensmeadow, who is a girl born without color and without magic, where everyone else in Fernwood is full of color and magic. So when her father disappears, she goes looking for him in the land of Furthermore with Oliver, a boy with secrets and lies. If you like Alice in Wonderland type portal fantasies that are maybe just a little bit dark, I think you'll love Furthermore. Gregory Maguire was born in 1954 and is still active today at the age of 70. He started as a children's author with The Lightning Time, published in 1978, and since then he's written almost 24 children's books, but of course, he is mostly known for Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West, published in 1995. If you've been living under a rock, this takes the Wicked Witch from Frank L. Baum's Oz story, actually mostly from the movies, and turns it on its head, reimagining Ephelba as the Wicked Witch and Glinda, who would later be Glinda, as the Good Witch, who are just two really misunderstood people going to school in the Emerald City. This is definitely not a children's story. It is very literary and dark and deep. What I also really love about this book is that when it came out, it really wasn't a top-selling bestseller because not that many people knew about it. It was very niche, but then it was adapted into a Broadway musical, and only then did people discover the novel and how wonderful it is, and it spent 26 weeks on the bestseller list. The musical has been adapted as a movie, which will be out later this year. But I'll tell you, the novel is a lot different than the musical, and I urge you to check out the book. I picked up John Marco's debut novel, Jackal of Nar, in 1999, and I was immediately hooked. Here's another brilliant fantasy author who came out strong, but then disappeared. So I hope people will rediscover him. The Jackal of Nar is the first book in the Tyrants and Kings trilogy. It is about Riccius Vantran, who is a general in an empire run by immortals with crystal blue eyes. He is ordered to stamp down a religious uprising, and at first he does so successfully, but then his eyes are opened that the empire he supports may actually be quite evil. It turns out the immortal emperor and a select group of cronies who are also immortal have been taking a longevity drug that turns their eyes crystal blue and also makes them go insane. I think this is a terrific book. There's a bit of dark fantasy, a bit of military fantasy, and maybe even some science fantasy. The Jackal of Nar was followed by The Grand Design in 2000 and concludes with The Saints of the Sword in 2001. Man, I really love these covers. It's time to bring out one of the big guns of fantasy. I mentioned him before, George R.R. Martin, born in 1948 and at 75 is still active. At least I hope he's still active because he hasn't finished his series A Song of Fire and Ice that started with Game of Thrones, published in 1996. Now, like many people, this is a novel I found Martin with, but he didn't come out of nowhere. He started publishing science fiction as early as 1970. In fact, his first short story was nominated for a Hugo. His debut novel was Dying of the Light, which was published in 1977, and it too was nominated for the Hugo. But for those of us who are epic fantasy buffs, we flock to Game of Thrones. It's a truly monumental story about the Seven Kingdoms and the Stark family who live in the north, where an enormous wall protects the kingdom from a land of ice for reasons that are forgotten. But when the rumor of winter is coming begins wending its way through the kingdom, we know something is up. Too bad the kingdom, which has just overthrown the Targaryen tyrants who once rode dragons, it's going through yet another rebellion when the new King Robert Baratheon dies. I mean, you probably know all this, thanks to the HBO mega hit series Game of Thrones, which is amazing. But I think the books are even more amazing. So rich in world building, character arcs, politics. There's so much to love. And yes, it is a dark fantasy, but there are 5 books out, and there are plans for a total of 7. So the series is unfinished. But hey, the series started when Martin was in his 40s, and now he's 75, so let's give him a little grace. I flip-flopped on whether to put Julian May in either the sci-fi or fantasy list. May was born in 1931 and died in 2017 at the age of 86. Her first short story, Dune Roller, was published in 1950 in astounding science fiction. Between 1956 and 1981, she wrote over 250 books for children and young adults. 250! I found her when she published her incredible adult science fiction novel, The Many-Colored Land, in 1981, about time travelers who exile themselves in a one-way trip to the Pliocene era. But the novel that really fascinated me was Black Trillium, published in 1990. This was an experiment between 3 authors, Marion Zimmer Bradley, Andre Norton, and Julian May. Now, I'm very conflicted when it comes to Marion Zimmer Bradley, but that won't stop me from recommending this series. The experiment was that this story about 3 princesses would be divided into 3 parts, and each author would take a point of view of one of the princesses. When their kingdom is invaded by a dark magician, the 3 princesses, Hermes, Anagil, and Kadia, would each go on a quest to find a piece of a magical talisman, and when they bring them together, it will summon their inheritance of controlling the ancient magic of the Black Trillium. Apparently, and I found this out as I researched it, this book wasn't really well critically received, but I really thought it was good. May went on to write 2 more in the series, Blood Trillium, published in 1992, and Sky Trillium, published in 1996. I know I've mentioned Brian McClellan before. McClellan was born in 1986 and debuted with Promise of Blood in 2013, the first book in the Powder Mage series. I know many people avoid it because it's either military fantasy or set in a world with guns, and that's true. There is a certain class of mage who can manipulate gunpowder, ergo powder mage. But there is so much more to this epic fantasy. Part of the story is told through a detective named Adamant trying to solve the mystery of the last words of a royal magic user. Oh, and by the way, the kingdom of Adro has just gone through a revolution to overthrow a tyrant, and the military leader is a powder mage named Tamis, who finds himself as the reluctant leader. Tamis' son is Taniel Two-Shot. He's another powder mage who's particularly talented and has some serious issues with his father. There are politics, including with a labor union, a really strong and intricate magic system, characters who are gritty yet honorable. Oh, and there are some deities who turn everything topsy-turvy. I highly recommend the Powder Mage trilogy and its sequel, the trilogy Gods of Blood and Powder, which starts with Sin of the Empire, published in 2017. Finally, we end this group of 10 authors with Shannon McGuire, born in 1978, who writes fantasy under her own name and science fiction under the pseudonym Mira Grant. She is very prolific, especially in short-form fiction, ever since her first short story was published in 2008. She may be most well known for her Wayward Children series of novellas. I've only read the first volume, Every Heart a Doorway, but I immediately loved it. The story is about a recovery house for underage kids who have returned from a journey through a portal fantasy. But what I'm going to recommend is Middle Game, published in 2020, which was nominated for a Hugo and won the Locus Award for Best Fantasy. It is a contemporary fantasy about an alchemist who creates two children, a boy and a girl, named Roger and Dodger, who are psychically connected as children, but then kind of lose that as they grow older. One of them is a master of languages, and the other is a master of mathematics. As adults, they alternate between exploring their powers and rejecting them. The alchemist who created them, James Reed, has his own agenda, as does yet another person he created, Aaron, who gets involved in Roger and Dodger's lives. The story is wild, probably considered a sci-fi fantasy mashup. I think it's literary, and it's a novel you really don't want to miss. We are starting with one of the classic authors of the fantasy genre, Patricia A. McKillop. McKillop was born in 1948 and died in 2022 at the age of 74. She has been nominated or won many awards, including the Hugo, Nebula, Locus, and a ton of Mythopoeic awards. She was the very first winner of the World Fantasy Award in 1975, which also went on to give her the World Fantasy Award for Lifetime Achievement in 2008. Her first publication was a children's book, The Throne of Errol Shirrell, published in 1973. Her first adult book was The Forgotten Beasts of Eld, published in 1974, which is the book that won her the first World Fantasy Award ever awarded, and it's the book I recommend. This is an amazing literary, sometimes melancholy, sometimes joyous story about Sybil, the daughter of a mighty wizard who is tasked to watch over a menagerie of magical mythic creatures. After her father passes away, Sybil is left alone to care for the beasts. But then she is visited by a knight named Corin who hands her a baby, a little boy named Tamlorn. Sybil agrees to raise the child, and since she's mostly been completely isolated from the outside world until this point, after she agrees to raise the boy, she is thrust into the world of men because of who the boy is. There is a touch of romance in the story, which may appeal to those who have just discovered romantasy, but I'm not sure because the romance subplot is very ethereal. Is that the right word? I don't know. But what I do know is that you will not be disappointed with The Forgotten Beasts of Eld. I've named him a diesel punk author. His name is China Miéville. He was born in 1972 and is still active today at the age of 52. In fact, he just recently released a novel this year co-authored with Keanu Reeves titled The Book of Elsewhere. I haven't read it, but if you have, let me know what you thought in the comments because I am curious. Anyway, I think his works, at least the ones I've read, falls generally into fantasy. But it is definitely a speculative mashup of fantasy and science fiction and a little bit of horror. He debuted with King Rat in 1998, which was nominated for both the Bram Stoker and the International Horror Guild Awards. But my absolute favorite of Miéville's novels is his Bass Lag books, which starts with Perdido Street Station, published in 2000, which is what I call diesel punk because the technology level of the society is sort of the dawn of the diesel engine. The world of Bass Lag not only has diesel engines, but also magic, and humans live side by side with other races like the Garuda, the bird people, and the Kafir, the insect people. The story takes place in the city of New Krobazin, where a scientist named Isaac is approached by Yagirik, one of the Garuda birdmen, to help him fly after his wings were removed as punishment. During researching to help Yagirak, they illegally acquire an experimental caterpillar, which comes from the government research labs and leads them down a very wild and psychedelic rabbit hole. The writing is so intense, so raw, so deep, I promise you, you haven't read anything like it before. I absolutely love Perdido Street Station and the two other novels, which are standalone stories, but they're set in Bass Lag. The Scar, published in 2002, which takes us on an expedition into the strange oceans of the world, and Iron Council, published in 2004, which is about a train that never stops, and the labor union, you heard me right, the labor union that follows it. Every time I do one of these, there's always one fantasy writer that I think should be better known, and that includes our next one, the brilliant Karen Miller, the Australian fantasy author who debuted with The Innocent Mage, published in 2005. She's also written a series of humorous fantasy novels under the pseudonym K.E. Mills, called the Rogue Agent series, which starts with The Accidental Sorcerer, published in 2008. I've read both of those series and think they're really good, but the book that really blew me away was The Empress, published in 2007. It's the first novel in the Godspeaker trilogy. Now, I think you could just read Empress as a standalone, but the trilogy starts with the Empress and is about the rise of a leader on one side of the conflict. The second book, The Riven Kingdom, is about the leader on the other side of the conflict. And finally, Hammer of God is when the two kingdoms collide. It's a great trilogy, but let's go back to the Empress, because it is so good and so unexpected. It is a true anti-hero story. It starts as a traditional fantasy about an orphan, this one a girl named Hikat. And from the start, even as a little kid, she is not a nice person. And as she grows, we can only describe her as evil. But the world around her is even more evil. For example, her father plans to rape her so she could produce sons to help him work the farm. So when I say evil, I'm not pussyfooting around. So as Hikat rises in power, mostly through devoting herself to this very mysterious god, we see the makings of a Dark Lord or a Dark Lady that would give Sauron a run for his money. I have never before rooted for the success of such a dark character. It is an amazing book, very dark and trigger warnings galore, so maybe it's not for everyone, but if you do read it, you won't forget it. At least I didn't. Leyland Exton Modisett Jr., otherwise known as L.E. Modisett Jr., was born in 1943 and is still active today in his 80s. He is very prolific, having written over 80 novels. He started publishing short stories in the pulps as early as 1973 His debut novel was The Fires of Paratime, published in 1982 about time-traveling immortals. But if you are a fantasy reader, you know the book and series that Modested is known for, and that's what I'm going to recommend. Yes, it is the Recluse series, which starts with The Magic of Recluse, published in 1991. If you recognize the cover art as being similar to the original Wheel of Time covers, it's because they're the same artist, the very talented Darrell Sweet. What sets the Recluse books apart from typical fantasy is that they are not about good versus evil. They are about order versus chaos. The magicians either wield black or white magic. Black is the magic of order. White is the magic of chaos. Usually, order is considered more stable, and our protagonist in Magic of Recluse is a young order magician named Laris who rebels against the structured, orderly life he is forced to grow up in. So he goes on a quest outside of his structured world where he finds out why chaos magic can be so destructive and unwieldy. There are now 22 Recluse novels. Oh, and the Recluse series has sold nearly 3 million copies. So if you haven't heard of Recluse yet, you probably want to at least give the first book a try. Silvia Moreno Garcia is a Mexican-Canadian author born in 1981. She debuted with This Strange Way of Dying in 2014. She's been a publisher of Innsmouth Free Press, which, as the name suggests, is devoted to Lovecraftian weird fiction. You probably know her for her novel Mexican Gothic, published in 2021, which was nominated for and won a slew of awards. But the novel I recommend is a very strange retelling of The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells, titled The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, published in 2023. And it was immediately shortlisted for the Hugo. I have this in fantasy, but it could go in science fiction. It's certainly a genre blend which flirts also with weird fiction and horror, as well as historical fiction. It's set in Yucatan, Mexico in the late 1800s. It is, of course, about Dr. Moreau, the mad scientist who tries to create humans, or new sentient beings from animals, and his daughter Carlotta. Moreau is in exile from France because of his unsavory experiments, and thus has settled in this very remote hacienda in the Yucatan to continue his experiments, funded by a wealthy man who thinks Moreau is going to create a cheap labor force that he can exploit. We alternate points of view between Carlotta, who begins very innocent and grows up quick, and Montgomery, Dr. Moreau's major domo, who sees things with a little more clarity than Carlotta. It's a very intense story, more character-driven than plot-driven, but I think it was very well done. Garth Nix is yet another Australian author born in 1963. He is still active today at the age of 61. He is one of my favorite children and young adult authors of all time, and I think he is eminently readable for adults. He began his career by self-publishing baby books called the Very Clever Baby series, but his claim to fame started in 1995 with the publication of Sabriel, the first novel in his young adult Old Kingdom series. But if you shy away from young adult books because of the romance-heavy subplots, I want to assure you there's nothing to worry about with Sabriel. This is good old-fashioned escapist fantasy. It's an adventure about necromancy. Yes, necromancy. Sabriel is a young girl going to an all-female boarding school when an undead creature invades the grounds. But Sabriel is the daughter of a necromancer and recognizes that this creature is carrying a message. And then she embarks on a quest that pits her against a dark necromancer. This is exactly the kind of young adult book that works for me. The entire series is fantastic and unexpected. My favorite of Nix's children's books, his middle grade books, are the Keys to the Kingdom series, which starts with Mr. Monday, published in 2003. It is a portal fantasy about a boy who must collect 7 keys to inherit and stabilize an otherworldly dimension. There are, of course, 7 books, each a character named after the day of the week, and each representing one of the 7 deadly sins. Mr. Monday, by the way, is sloth. One of my favorite adult fantasy authors is Naomi Novik, born in 1973 and active today at the age of 51. She has written some fantastic standalone fantasy novels like Uprooted, published in 2015 based on a Polish fairy tale, which went on to win the Nebula, and Spinning Silver, published in 2018, the retelling of Rumpelstiltskin from a Jewish perspective, which was nominated for the Hugo and Nebula and won several fantasy awards. But I fell in love with Novik's writing with her debut novel, Her Majesty's Dragon, published in 2006. It's an alternate history version of the Napoleonic Wars, with the twist being that dragons existed during this time, this period with cannons and rifles. So, in this world, when a dragon hatches from an egg, and if there's a human nearby, the baby dragon bonds with the human. Every region of the world has a different type of dragon, so when Captain Lawrence seizes a French frigate and finds a black dragon egg that no one's ever seen before, that's bound for Napoleon himself, he knows that he must get it immediately to the British authorities. Unfortunately, the egg hatches and the baby dragon bonds with Captain Lawrence and sets him on a very different course than he was imagining his life to go. Because now he is responsible for what could be one of the most powerful dragons in Britain's aerial draconic fleet. I am telling you, the voice of the writing is so clever and funny, I dare you not to fall in love with Captain Lawrence and his dragon, Temeraire. Although the first book was written as a standalone, Novik went on to write 9 novels in the series. After the first 3, to be honest, I think they get a little repetitive, but I still read them all, and the conclusion, the final book, League of Dragons, published in 2016, brings the series to, I think, a very satisfactory conclusion. I love the story of how Christopher Paolini became a writer. He was born in 1983 and is still active today at 40. He started writing the book that would make him famous when he was 15 years old. 15! The book is, of course, the young adult novel, Aragon, which was finally self-published in 2002 when Christopher Paolini was 18. Through a series of very fortunate events, the book was brought to the attention of a big publishing house who bought the book and the subsequent books in the series, published them, and the rest is history. Now, the story itself has a very similar premise to the Temeraire novel I just mentioned regarding dragons. That is, when a dragon is hatched from an egg, it is bonded to a human if there's a human nearby. That's what happens to Aragon when he finds a blue dragon egg that hatches and Saphira is born. Dragons in this world are rare, mostly because they've been killed off. Dragon riders used to be protectors of the kingdom until the tyrant king, Galbatrox, comes to power and kills them off. Now, yes, the story is derivative of other fantasy novels. We see elves and dwarves, etc. And if you saw the movie, it really is evident how derivative it is. But if you read it, you can't help feeling the joy for the genre that the young Paolini had in writing this story. And he's gone on to publish adult science fiction, which has been well received, especially the novel To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, published in 2020. Tamora Pierce was born in 1954 and is active today at the age of 69. She is known as a young adult writer and has won several awards. Now, what I think is fascinating is that Pierce never meant to write for young adults. In the late 70s, she wrote a 732-page epic fantasy for adults called Song of the Lioness, but she could not sell it. No one would pick it up. Finally, she got an agent who suggested maybe this would be better off as a young adult series. So she chopped it up into 4 parts, got rid of the more mature adult scenes, and thus her career as a young adult author was born with the publication of her debut novel, Alana, the first adventure, published in 1983. This story is so much fun, and it's so young adult. It's about twins, a brother and sister. The sister's named Alana, and her brother is named Tom. Now, the traditional fantasy kingdom they live in is a bit sexist, where boys can be recruited or drafted as knights. That's what happens to Tom, who is a pacifist and wants to study magic. Well, his sister has no problem with violence. Alana wants to be a knight, even though she has a magic power as a healer. So they switch places. Alana disguises herself as a boy and calls herself Alan and goes to be trained as a knight, while Tom goes off to magic school. Alana has to keep her identity secret, which also means keeping her power as a healer secret. But then plague sweeps the kingdom. The setup is so perfect for a great young adult story, and there's not really much romance in it for those who care. I highly recommend the Lioness series by Tamora Pierce. We are ending with one of the greatest names in fantasy ever, Terry Pratchett. Pratchett was born in 1948 and died in 2015 at the age of 66 after a very public struggle with early onset Alzheimer's. Pratchett debuted with The Dark Side of the Sun, a science fiction novel published in 1976. But like me, you probably know him for the Discworld novels, which started with The Color of Magic, published in 1983. These are satirical, supremely funny novels with that very dry humor you can only seem to find among British authors. The fantasy novels are set in Discworld, the supremely improbable, flat world that rests on the back of 4 elephants who ride upon the shell of an enormous turtle that swims through the universe. The Color of Magic introduces us to the largest city on Discworld called Ankh-Morpork. The main character is Rincewind, a wizard who seems to be a bit of a slacker who doesn't have much magic. Rincewind gets hired as a tour guide to an insurance clerk named Twoflower, who has a hoard of gold that follows him around in a large piece of magic luggage. The whole setup is silly and wonderful. Just like all of his books, The Color of Magic is actually part of a duology that concludes with The Light Fantastic, published in 1986. Now, after those first 2 books, all the Discworld novels are standalones and can be read in any order, though there are tons of recommended reading orders, many of which suggest not to start with Color of Magic. So do your own research. There are 41 books in total, and some of my favorites are The Weird Sisters, published in 1988, about some of the witches in Discworld, and introduces us to my favorite character, Granny Weatherwax. Hogfather, which is a hilarious and amazing depiction of Discworld's version of Santa Claus, and Guards, about Ankh-Morpork's Night Watch, who are guards that have to deal with a coup against the patrician, the city's leader. Pratchett has left a truly wonderful legacy of stories with his Discworld novels that I am sure will be with us for many, many generations. First in this group is Sir Philip Pullman, who was born in 1946 and is active today at the age of 78. And yes, you heard me right, Sir Philip. He was knighted in 2019 for his service to literature. He has been named one of the 50 greatest British writers since 1945 by Time magazine, and he was president of the Society of Authors, a position once held by Sir Alfred Lord Tennyson. So yeah, Pullman is kind of a big name. And what he's known for is a fantasy series called His Dark Materials, which starts with Northern Lights, published in 1995. In North America, it was published under the title The Golden Compass. These books have been criticized by Christians in general and the Catholic Church specifically because, as one critic noted, it is atheism for kids. Oh, did I mention it's a children's book? Talk about bearing the lead. I have a story about how I picked up a children's book in a second, but first, why the Catholic Church specifically? Well, the main villain in the Dark Materials is the Magisterium, which is the same name that the Catholic Church calls their authority to interpret the Word of God. In Dark Materials, the Magisterium looks an awful lot like the Catholic Church and maintains its tyrannical control through dogmatic religion. In this case, it's a religion concerning dust, which is this mysterious particle that is in the atmosphere. Everyone also has an animal familiar called a daemon, which is a not-so-subtle metaphor for the soul. The Magisterium is funding experiments to cut the bond between daemon and human for research on how to better control people. The main character is a young girl named Lyra, who investigates these experiments after his friend is kidnapped as a test subject. Now, if you say you don't read children's books, fair enough, but I still urge you to give this one a try because I think it transcends age category, and especially if you think you might be intrigued by books concerning the danger of dogmatic religions. Now, my story is that I picked up a copy of The Golden Compass way back in the 90s at a bookstore in the Castro, which is the San Francisco gay neighborhood. I had no idea it was a children's book because it was shelved in the adult section, and I have no idea why they did this. Maybe not enough kids visited the bookstore. Maybe they thought it would sell more in the adult section. Maybe someone couldn't tell the difference. But I had no idea it was a children's book, even while I was reading it. Oh, and this bookstore also stocked some of Garth Nix's young adult books in the adult section. Anyway, check out his Dark Materials. Melanie Ron was born in 1954 and is active today. Here's another one of those fantasy authors that we don't know much about, but she's been around for a while. Ever since her debut novel, Dragon Prince, published in 1988, the first book in the Dragon Prince trilogy. Now, romantasy may sound like a shiny new subgenre, but trust me, it's been around forever, and you'll find that out if you read The Dragon Prince. It is about Prince Rohan, who is a pawn in a kingdom where dragons are very much real. He is supposed to marry one of the High Prince's daughters, but doing so means he might get assassinated. In fact, it's very likely he will be, so his aunt, who is Lady of the Goddess, helps him to secretly marry the beautiful Sioned, who possesses the magic power to manipulate light. They must keep the marriage a secret and try to fool the High Prince, who is still scheming to marry him off to one of his daughters. I liked this trilogy when it came out. I think it still holds up. If you like epic fantasy, politics, dragons, magic, all with a dash of romance thrown in, I think you'll love the Dragon Prince trilogy. Rick Riordan was born in 1964 and is very much active today. He is, of course, the mastermind behind the Percy Jackson universe that starts with Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, published in 2005. These books have become mega bestsellers and it's already considered a children's classic. But did you know that was not his debut novel? In fact, his debut novel wasn't even a children's book. It was a mystery called The Big Red Tequila, published in 1997, about a private investigator named Trey Navarra, who leaves the San Francisco Bay Area to return to his hometown in Texas to solve his father's murder. It's the first book in a series about Trey Navarra's cases, which has won several awards. In fact, a later book in the series won the Edgar Award, which is the highest award given to mystery writers. So, why did he turn to children's books? Well, because he was a father and he was making up stories for his son about ancient Greek heroes. Percy Jackson is a modern 12-year-old boy who finds out his biological father is a Greek god, and he is whisked off to Camp Half-Blood, where demigods are trained and raised. When Zeus's lightning bolt is stolen, Percy and his friends are set on a quest to retrieve it. Oh, remember I said Riordan made this story for his son? Well, his son is dyslexic and has ADHD, and so does Percy Jackson. In the universe of ancient gods, Riordan has expanded it to other pantheons, and there are over 40 books with various different characters, like the popular Magnus Chase and the gods of Asgard. My favorite thing about Riordan is he has teamed up with Disney to form an imprint to publish books based on non-Western cultures by authors of those cultures. Patrick Rothfuss was born in 1973 and is hopefully still active today. He's suffering a bit from George R.R. Martinism in that his planned series has seemingly taken a long hiatus. By that, I mean the last book he published was in 2011, and we're still waiting for the sequel. So we're going to have to talk about this series, The King Killer Chronicle, because it starts with his debut, The Name of the Wind, published in 2007. This novel is what I would call literary. It has some of the most gorgeous language you'll ever come across in fantasy. The main character is Kvothe, and the story is a frame story where we meet an older Kvothe who runs a modest little inn. He is recognized by a scribe and agrees to tell his story. And we follow Kvothe's life from childhood, where he started as a child of performers of a traveling troupe, which turns dark and tragic and leads him on the road where he'll eventually be nicknamed the King Killer. The sequel, Wise Man's Fear, was published in 2011 and is just as good as the first book. This series has sold millions of copies and received much well-deserved critical acclaim. The series is supposed to conclude with a book under the working title The Doors of Stone, but like I said, it hasn't been finished. Rothfuss hasn't been idle. He's founded a publishing imprint called Underthing Press. He's co-written a comic series called Rick and Morty versus Dungeons & Dragons. Speaking of Dungeons & Dragons, he's a huge fan, and he's a player, and he was a guest on Critical Role. But, even if he never completes the series, I still recommend The Name of the Wind. It's that well written. Okay, here's an author I just recently added to this list, another children's author, Katherine Rundell, who was born in 1987 and is very much active today. I have to give a shout out to one of my followers, Lynette. Hey, Lynette, who recommended this book to me. Impossible Creatures was finally published this year in North America, but it came out last year in other parts of the world. Now, this author wasn't on my radar, but Rundell has been publishing since her debut. The Girl Savage was published in 2011. Her second novel, Rooftoppers, was published in 2013 and won the Waterstones Children's Book Prize and the Blue Peter Book Award. Now, if you don't recognize those awards, then you probably aren't British, because I don't think she was very well known outside of Britain. That is not until Impossible Creatures, which is out right now, and at the time of filming is the #1 children's book on the New York Times bestseller list. It's a portal fantasy about a boy named Christopher who animals seem to be automatically attracted to and automatically follow him. And he finds out his family are guardians of this gate between our world and the world of magic. A girl named Mel comes through the gate with her baby Griffin and is followed by a killer. Christopher and Mel escape through the portal and find themselves on a quest to maybe save all of magic. This is very well written, whimsical, and surprisingly bittersweet. More than I would expect from a children's book. It is definitely a standalone, though because of its tremendous success, more books are planned, and I can't wait. Christine Catherine Rush was born in 1960 and is active today. She has been quite prolific in her career, writing over 100 books. She's also won a Hugo for her writing and also won a Hugo for her editing. She was the editor of the Magazine of Science Fiction and Fantasy for 6 years. She's also married to an even more prolific writer, Dean Wesley Smith, and they've collaborated together on several projects. She's also written many media tie-in books set in the world of Star Wars, X-Men, Star Trek, and on and on. She's another one I'm surprised hasn't become more well-known. But the series I recommend is the Fae series, which starts with The Sacrifice, published in 1995. It is about the Fae, these magical elvish creatures, but here the Fae are dark. Some may say grimdark, and very powerful. In fact, they are intent on taking over the world, and they probably are destined to succeed. That is, until they try to conquer Blue Isle and find out that their destiny to take over the world may not go as smoothly as they had hoped. The story unfolds from many points of view. I personally thought the series was intense, but it is also very dark, maybe too dark for some people. I don't know. Check it out. If you are a fan of Dungeons & Dragons, then you know the name R.A. Salvatore, who was born in 1959 and is active today. Now, back in the 80s, you could send your novel directly to publishers into what is known as the slush pile. That's what Salvatore did with a novel he had written, and TSR, who at the time was publishing D&D books, that's when Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman became big names, and they picked up this novel from the slush that he sent, and they didn't like the novel, but they liked his writing. So he was contracted to write novels in a little D&D universe called Forgotten Realms. I know, if you aren't a Dungeons & Dragons super fan, you're shrugging your shoulders, but if you are a fan, I think you know what I'm talking about. His first novel was The Crystal Shard, published in 1988, which introduces Drizzt, the dark elf character who would become legendary in the Forgotten Realms universe. He's a dark elf or drow who is reformed, who turns to good and away from the evil nature of the dark elves who are governed by the evil spider goddess. Okay, I know it sounds silly, but the books are fun. And the books are small, but now you can get an entire story arc in one omnibus compilation like this one. This is a Legacy of the Drow collector's edition, which has the 4 books that compile Legacy of the Drow, a series that ran from 1992 to 1996 and hit the New York Times bestseller list. Salvatore has written over 50 Forgotten Realms books, mostly starring Drizzt. He's also written outside of Forgotten Realms, but he'll probably always be known as the creator of Drizzt. Maybe one of the biggest names in fantasy today is Brandon Sanderson. Sanderson was born in 1975 and made history with his Kickstarter campaign that raised over $40 million for 4 upcoming self-published fantasy novels. And yes, I got them too. Now, I like to say that I discovered Sanderson because I picked up his debut novel, Elantris, in 2005. I liked the cover, I liked the blurb, and most importantly, I liked the story at least enough that when his next book came out, I automatically picked it up, and that book was The Final Empire, published in 2006, the first book in the Mistborn trilogy. The premise was fascinating. What if the Dark Lord wins? That's what happened on the world of Scadrial, which for 1,000 years has turned into this dystopian nightmare, ruled over by the immortal Dark Lord when he took power. Now, Sanderson is known for his really detailed, logical magic system, and that starts here in Mistborn with Allomancy, where magic users gain their power by ingesting metal, and each metal has a specific magic ability. Normally, a magic user can only use one metal, but the Mistborn can use them all. The main character is Vin, who is a street urchin who discovers she may be one of the legendary Mistborn. Could she also be the one who can defeat the 1,000-year rule of the Dark Lord? Now, Sanderson has gone on to publish many other novels, including finishing the Wheel of Time series after Robert Jordan passed away. He is super prolific, having also written middle grade, young adult, and recently even a picture book. His magnum opus is the Stormlight Archives, which is a massive and dense epic fantasy that's not complete. There are 4 books, 5 out later this year, in a planned 10-book series. It is probably, in my opinion, his best work. But whenever anyone asks me for a Sanderson recommendation, I always go back to the original Mistborn trilogy. I think it's the perfect introduction to Sanderson. Elizabeth Ann Scarborough was born in 1947 and is active today at the age of 77. She has published over 40 novels, including collaborating with Anne McCaffrey. Her debut novel was Song of Sorcery, published in 1982, which is the first in the Argonia series. She won the Nebula Award in 1989 with her science fiction novel The Healer's War, about a nurse during the Vietnam War who finds a strange artifact. Scarborough, by the way, was also a nurse in Vietnam, so that book was pretty personal to her. My recommendation, though, is The Godmother, published in 1994, which is basically about a fairy godmother who answers the call of a social worker living in Seattle who needs help with her caseload. Now, I know how the premise sounds, very fun and whimsical, and it is, but it can also be pretty dark, since social workers deal with a lot of really dark things like child abuse, so look up trigger warnings if that's an issue. There's inspiration from several fairy tales, notably Hansel and Gretel. If you like magic, powerful older women, this book is just for you. We end this group of 10 with a very big name, V.E. Schwab, who also writes under the name Victoria Schwab. Schwab was born in 1987 and is, of course, active today. Her debut was a young adult novel called The Near Witch, published in 2011 by Disney. I personally really enjoyed her Shades of Magic series, which starts with the Darker Shades of Magic, published in 2015. It's about these parallel dimensions of London, defined by their color. So there's red London, gray London, white London, black London. I thought this one was a bit of a romantasy, but I think it's a terrific read. My recommendation is one of her later books, which I think really elevated Schwab's reputation as a writer, and that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, published in 2020. I call this a modern-day dark fairy tale. Addie LaRue was born in the early 1700s in France and makes a Faustian deal with the devil, or at least some strange dark creature, to live forever, but there's a price. No one can ever remember her name or who she is. She has to go through eternity, never leaving a mark on the world. But what does it mean when she meets a man who does remember her? I don't know if you'd call this a romance, but there's this very interesting relationship that goes in unexpected ways. It's part historical fiction. There's a bit of magical realism. It's really good. In fact, I named it as my top book of 2020. We are getting off to a rocky start. Rocky because this author should have been included in the last segment, because Mickey Zucker's full name, her correct name, is Mickey Zucker Reichert. So she should have been included in part 9 with the R's, but I'm slipping her in now because this is my list and I'll do what I want. Mickey Zucker Reichert was born in 1962 and is active today. I have to have her on this list because she wrote one of my favorite fantasy series ever, the Ren-Shay trilogy, which starts with The Last Ren-Shay, published in 1992. Now, this is set or inspired by Norse mythology, Odin, Loki, all that, which I know is well-trod ground, but Reichert gives it a whole new twist. In the story, a prophecy claims the tribe of the Renshei will destroy Midgard, so all the other tribes gang up and kill all of them, or at least they think they do, but hey, there's at least one survivor, the last Renshei. But there's also this really interesting group of 4 wizards who govern the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, and are supposed to maintain the balance between good and evil and neutrality. I was obsessed with the original Renshei trilogy, which continues with The Western Wizard, published in 1992, and concludes with Child of Thunder, published in 1992. I think the series is brilliant. If you like a solid epic fantasy trilogy, check out the original Renshei trilogy. And if you like those, there are even more books in the Renshei universe. Sherwood Smith was born in 1951 and is very active today at the age of 73. Here's another author who really should be more recognized. She's a Nebula finalist, collaborated with Andre Norton and others, and is well known for helping other writers. She debuted with the novel Wren to the Rescue in 1990, a story she started when she was in high school and has since expanded that series to 7 novels. My favorite, however, is Inda, published in 2006. It is about a prince who is not the heir but the spare, who goes to a military academy to learn the art of war, but then his life is changed forever when a classmate dies and he ends up having to run off to the high seas and become a pirate. Yes, you heard me right, a pirate. This is the start of what I think is a really well-crafted series that continues with The Fox, published in 2007, and King's Shield, published in 2008, and Treason's Shore, published in 2009. If you like epic fantasy, and if you like pirates or stories set in the high seas, I think you'll absolutely love the Inda series. Next up is Mary Stewart, who was born in 1916 and died in 2014 at the age of 97. Mary Stewart did not start with speculative fiction. Rather, her debut was this cozy mystery titled Madam, Will You Talk, published in 1955. She mostly stuck with romantic mysteries until she published her greatest, or at least her most renowned work, on the Arthurian saga, which starts with The Crystal Cave, published in 1970. Now, before Stewart, the Arthurian legend was defined by T.H. White's Once and Future King series, which in turn was inspired by Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur. Now, up until this point, the Arthurian legend was mostly about Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and the triangle between Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere. What Mary Stewart did was focus on who I think is the most interesting character of all, Merlin. She retells the legend of Arthur from the point of view of Merlin, starting from the time when Merlin is a young boy and progressing up to his fall. If you are a fan of the legend of King Arthur or have any curiosity of what the legend of King Arthur might be like from Merlin's perspective, you have to read Mary Stewart's Arthurian saga. Jonathan Stroud is a British author born in 1970 and is active today at the age of 54. He is a children's author, and you know there are several children's authors in my list, but I don't always recommend children's books to adults who don't read children's books, but there are some exceptions, and Jonathan Stroud's one of those exceptions because of the Bartimaeus sequence that starts with The Amulet of Samarkand, published in 2003. The story is set in an alternate version of England where magic is very real and very regulated. The main character is Nathaniel, a 12-year-old boy who is also a very precocious, up-and-coming magician. Nathaniel summons the djinn Bartimaeus to help stop an evil magician from taking control of England. This is a lot darker and more political than, say, Harry Potter, and I personally think it was a lot better written, and I think a little bit more mature. The series has won tons of awards, and again, I think the writing itself is elevated, and Stroud uses humor in a way that doesn't get in the way of the story. Check it out. You know he was coming. If you have watched me at all, you know the fantasy author I practically worship. Yes, I'm talking about J.R.R. Tolkien, born in 1892 and died in 1973 at the age of 81. He was a veteran of World War I who went on to become a professor of English language and literature at Oxford. He was a gifted linguist who was called upon to be a codebreaker in World War II. But of course, his claim to fame came after writing a children's book called The Hobbit, published in 1937. This unexpected journey became an unexpected success, and the publisher convinced Tolkien to write a sequel. Well, the sequel kept expanding until it grew into The Lord of the Rings, the first volume of which is The Fellowship of the Ring, published in 1954. Now, as you may have noted, The Lord of the Rings is not really a children's book, not like The Hobbit, and that led to a rather tumultuous publishing history, but I think it is interesting that the first part of the story of Lord of the Rings, Bilbo's birthday party, reads more like The Hobbit than anything else before gradually becoming more serious or starker or darker when they get to Bree. Anyway, I know I'm not alone with being obsessed with Lord of the Rings. I think it may have to do with when I read it. I think I was in the 7th grade when I was first discovering books, so that made it more magical. And also, it may have been my generation. I don't know. I just love the books. I've reread them multiple times, and whether they are to your taste or not, it is indisputable that they are the template upon which all modern fantasy is based. I forget how I ended up finding this next author, but it is Emma Torres. And I'm so happy I picked up her 2023 debut, Inkblood Sister Scribe. This is a contemporary fantasy where magic books secretly exist in our modern world, but only known to a select few. Abe Calatay is one of those who secretly protects his small little library of magic books, but then he violently dies and he leaves his books to his 2 daughters, Joanna and Esther. But they are given 2 very different instructions after his death. Joanna must protect the library and the books, and Esther must constantly travel, move from place to place, and never stop. I will say you need to give this book a few chapters to really get going. To me, for some reason, the writing the first couple of chapters seemed a little dense. But then after that, bam, it really gets going. As much as this is a contemporary fantasy, it is also a thriller, so get ready for a fast-paced, rip-roaring adventure that takes a few unexpected twists and turns. I'm probably going to get a little flack for putting this next author on this list, but it's my list. I am talking about Gore Vidal, born in 1925 and died in 2012 at the age of 86. He was a prolific writer, first published in 1946 with the mystery adventure Willawong that Vidal wrote when he was in the Navy at 19 years old. He became a bit infamous when the novel City and the Pillar was published in 1948, which is actually a pretty rebellious gay novel for the time. He went on to become a very prominent figure, being tenuously related to Jackie Kennedy and having open feuds with Truman Capote, William F. Buckley, and Norman Mailer. For his writing, Vidal is probably best known for his historical fiction series, Narratives of the Empire, about the unconventional history of the United States, which starts with Washington, D.C., published in 1967, and ends with The Golden Age, published in 2000. But I have a soft spot for his more speculative novels, notably Myra Breckinridge, published in 1968, and its sequel, Myron, published in 1974. But my absolute favorite is Duluth, published in 1983. Before the movie Inception, there was Duluth, the story about a novel, about a soap opera, who has the same characters as the actual town of Duluth, and what happens to the soap opera characters also happens to the citizens of Duluth, or vice versa. And there are flying saucers. This can only be described as trippy. It is funny. It is ridiculous. It is so meta. I really hope more people will discover this other side of Gore Vidal. Helene Wecker was born in 1975 and is active today at 49. Now, I was actually recommended this book when I was doing a video on Omegle and was asking people for book recommendations, and someone suggested The Golem and the Genie, Helene Wecker's 2013 debut. This one sounded really intriguing, and I ended up picking it up, and I am so glad I did. This is a historical fantasy set mostly in New York towards the end of the 19th century. The Golem was created by this renegade Jewish magician and is in the form of a woman named Shava, who tries to pass herself off as human when she is abandoned in the Jewish neighborhood of New York. The genie is accidentally set free by a tinsmith in the New York neighborhood called Little Syria. The genie's name is Ahmed, and he had been trapped in a bottle for 1,000 years. This is a story of the pyrotechnics caused by the meeting of these two strangers in a strange land. Ultimately, it's a clash, or it's a reconciliation of two cultures. It is really well written, and I cannot recommend it enough. Margaret Weiss was born in 1948 and is active today at 76. She is best known for her collaborations with Tracy Hickman, and if you are a Dungeons & Dragons fan, you probably know them for their Dragonlance Chronicle, starting with Dragons of Autumn Twilight, published in 1984, and my personal favorite, the Legend series that starts with Time of the Twins, published in 1986. This was a heyday of a D&D renaissance, and there were a whole lot of schlocky D&D novels back then, but the Weiss and Hickman books were, I thought, always of a high caliber. But my favorite series is when they departed from the D&D franchise and wrote the Deathgate cycle, starting with Dragonwing, published in 1990. This 7-book series is about the war between two powerful races, the Sartan and the Patrons. The Sartan won by sundering the world into 4 elemental realms and imprisoning the Patrons in the Labyrinth. The story is about Haplo, the first patron to have escaped the Labyrinth. These books contain a lot of familiar territory to D&D players, but there are so many little clever twists, and the world building is so unique that it, I think, stands above everything else they have written, at least in my opinion. And the writing is so fun and easy. It won't feel like you're reading a dense series, even though you are reading 7 books. I cannot sing the praises enough to the Deathgate cycle, especially if you're a fan of D&D. The last author on this list is Janny Wurts, born in 1953 and is active today at the age of 70. Her debut novel was Storm Warden, published in 1984. But my introduction to her was Daughter of the Empire, published in 1987, her collaboration with Raymond Feist, which was a spin-off on his Rift War saga. I personally think the Empire trilogy with Janny Wurts and Feist are the best of all the Rift War novels, and it's probably because of Janny Wurts. Her magnum opus, however, is The War of Light and Shadow. It's a series which is divided into arcs. I think you could read the first book, Curse of the Mistwraith, published in 1993, as a standalone. It is about 2 brothers. One can control the light, and one can control the darkness or shadows, and they are raised apart to be enemies, but then they are drawn together as allies to defeat the Mistwraith. I love the writing. I think this is a supremely talented author, and if you are into fantasy, you have to at least dip your foot into the genius of Janny Wurts. And we are done. That is my list of top 100 fantasy authors. Were your favorite fantasy authors on this list, or did I miss them? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Oh, and I also put together a list of my top 100 favorite science fiction authors, so be sure to check that out if you're interested. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.